Hey guys, tonight we step back nearly 200 years to a world where the simple act of surviving winter required every ounce of strength, cunning, and sheer stubborn willpower your ancestors could muster. Imagine standing on a wooden porch somewhere in rural Ohio, or maybe the prairies of Illinois, watching your breath crystallize in the October air while knowing, truly knowing in your bones, that the next 5 months will test everything you have. No thermostat to nudge upward. No grocery store stocked with fresh produce flown in from California. No emergency services to call when the snow pile's higher than your cabin door. Just you, your family, and whatever preparations you managed to complete before that first hard frost arrived. And here's the sobering truth. You probably wouldn't survive this. Most of us modern folks wouldn't last 2 weeks without reaching for a phone that doesn't exist yet. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love knowing whether you're drifting off in a cozy apartment in Toronto or tucked into bed somewhere in rural Texas. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand at the edge of your small clearing, watching the maple trees surrender their last crimson leaves to a wind that carries something new, something sharp and unforgiving. The year is 1847, give or take, and you've been living on this patch of frontier land for 3 years now. Long enough to know what's coming. Long enough to feel that particular dread settle into your stomach like a stone dropped into cold water. The first frost arrived 2 nights ago. You woke before dawn to find delicate ice crystals painted across the inside of your single glass window, a luxury your wife insisted upon when you built this place, and one you've never regretted despite the expense. Through that frosted pane, you watched the meadow grass transformed into a field of tiny silver swords, each blade encased in its own glittering armour. Beautiful, certainly. But you've learned that beauty often masks danger out here, and frost is no exception. Your children noticed it too, of course. The younger ones pressed their noses against that precious glass, giggling at the patterns, their breath adding new fog to the existing frost. They don't fully understand yet. To them, frost means the excitement of coming snow, the possibility of sledding down the hill behind the barn, the promise of Christmas somewhere in the foggy future. They haven't lived through enough winters to carry the weight you carry now. But your oldest, Sarah, who just turned 13, caught your eye across the cabin that morning. You saw the flicker of understanding there, the recognition that frost means something far more serious than snowball fights and holiday celebrations. She's been helping with the preparation since August, and she knows exactly how much work remains undone. The truth settles over you like a heavy quilt. Winter survival in 1840s. America isn't decided in winter at all. It's decided months earlier, during those sweltering July afternoons when chopping firewood seemed almost absurd, during the September harvest rush when your back screamed for rest but the corn wouldn't wait, during all those countless small decisions about what to preserve, what to store, and what to sacrifice. By the time that first frost paints your window, the verdict is essentially already rendered. You're either ready or you're not. And not ready carries consequences that modern minds can scarcely comprehend. You think about the Henderson family 2 miles east through the woods. Last winter they ran out of firewood in February. James Henderson had underestimated, figured 8 cords would see them through, didn't account for that brutal cold snap that lasted 3 weeks. By the time neighbours realised something was wrong, the family had burned their furniture, their spare lumber, even the wooden toys James had carved for his children. They survived, barely huddled in a single corner of their cabin wrapped in every blanket and piece of clothing they owned. Mrs. Henderson lost 3 toes to frostbite. Their youngest, little Thomas, developed a cough that lingered well into summer. You will not let that happen to your family. This thought pulses through you with each heartbeat as you survey your preparations, mentally cataloguing what's done and what still needs doing. The root cellar is nearly full. That's something. Potatoes, turnips, carrots, and beets packed in straw, arranged with careful attention to the lessons your father taught you back in Vermont. Apples stored separately, because you learned the hard way that apples release something into the air that makes other vegetables spoil faster. Historians still argue whether frontier families understood the science behind this, or simply observed the pattern and adapted, but either way, the knowledge saves lives. Your smokehouse holds the fruits of last month's butchering, hams, bacon sides, and sausages dangling from hooks like some macabre decoration. The smell of hickory smoke still clings to your clothes from those long days of tending the fire, keeping it cool enough to smoke but not hot enough to cook. A delicate balance that took you years to master. One of your neighbours swears by applewood for smoking, claims it gives the meat a sweeter flavour. Another insists that only oak produces proper preservation. You've tried both, honestly can't tell much difference, but you enjoy the debates that fill those long smoking days. The firewood situation looks acceptable, though acceptable is a relative term that makes your stomach clench. You've got roughly 9 cords stacked against the cabin's north wall, and another cord of kindling split and stored in the lean-to. The rule of thumb passed down through generations suggests 10 cords minimum for a family your size, more if winter runs long or cold. You're close, you're almost there. But almost, in this world, can mean the difference between life and death. And here's something your modern mind might not immediately grasp. That woodpile represents hundreds of hours of labour. Each of those logs was once a standing tree that you felled with an axe. No chainsaws, no hydraulic splitters, just steel and muscle and determination. You cut it into manageable lengths, split it into burnable pieces, hauled it back to the cabin, and stacked it with the bark facing upward to shed rain and snow. Multiply that process by roughly 3,000 individual pieces of firewood, and you begin to understand why pioneers spoke of winter preparation as a year-round occupation rather than a seasonal chore. Your wife, Elizabeth, appears in the cabin doorway wiping her hands on her apron. She's been inside working on the last batch of apple butter, and the sweet tart smell wafts out behind her like a gentle ghost. The circles under her eyes tell the story of too many late nights spent preserving, mending, and preparing. She hasn't complained once. Complaining wastes energy that could be spent working. But you've noticed her moving slower lately. Noticed the way she pauses sometimes with one hand pressed against the small of her back. "Geese flew over this morning," she says, her voice carrying that particular flatness that means she's worried but doesn't want to alarm the children. "Flying low." You nod, understanding immediately. Geese flying low supposedly means a harsh winter coming. It's folk wisdom, the kind of thing that makes scientists roll their eyes. But out here, folk wisdom has kept people alive for generations. Whether the geese actually know something about approaching weather patterns, or whether it's all coincidence and confirmation bias, hardly matters. What matters is that everyone in this community watches those geese, interprets their flight, and prepares accordingly. Other signs have been pointing the same direction. The woolly bear caterpillars you've spotted lately have unusually wide black bands, traditionally interpreted as a prediction of severe cold. The hornets built their nest higher than usual this year, supposedly indicating deep snow to come. Squirrels have been gathering nuts with what can only be described as frantic energy, building caches larger than you've seen in previous years. None of this is scientific, of course. Meteorologists would point out that animal behaviour is far too variable and localised to serve as reliable weather prediction. And yet, your grandfather swore by these signs, and he lived to 83 in a world where reaching 50 was considered a reasonable achievement. Your father watched the animals every autumn, and his winter preparations were legendary throughout the county back in Vermont. There's something to be said for accumulated observation, even if it can't be quantified or peer-reviewed. The quirky truth is this. Some of these folk predictions have shown surprising correlation with actual weather patterns when studied systematically. The woolly bear caterpillar's bands, for instance, do seem to vary based on conditions during their growth period, which occurs in late summer and early fall, essentially recording the weather that has already happened rather than predicting what's to come. But since autumn conditions often correlate with winter severity in certain regions, the caterpillars become accidentally accurate prophets. Nature is sneaky like that. You take a deep breath of that October air, feeling it sharp in your lungs, and make a decision. Tomorrow, you'll fell another 2 trees. It means exhausting labour when your body's already worn thin from harvest work, but that woodpile needs to grow. You cannot face February with doubt gnawing at your thoughts, cannot lie awake wondering if you'll have enough fuel to keep your children warm. Elizabeth nods when you tell her, as if she expected nothing less. She reaches out, squeezes your hand once briefly, a rare display of physical affection in this world where such gestures feel like luxuries, and then turns back toward the cabin and the work waiting inside. The sun is lowering now, painting the clearing in shades of amber and gold that would be beautiful under other circumstances. Your children's laughter drifts from somewhere behind the barn. where they're probably playing their last outdoor games before the cold truly settles in. Soon enough, they'll be confined to the cabin's cramped interior, tripping over each other and testing everyone's patience. But that's a problem for future you. Present you has preparations to complete. You head toward the barn to check on the animals one more time before nightfall, your boots crunching on the frost-stiffened grass. The cow needs extra hay. The chickens need their coop inspected for drafts. The old horse needs... Well, honestly, the old horse needs retirement, but that's not something frontier families can afford. He'll work until he can't work anymore, and then he'll become food for a family that can't afford sentiment. It's harsh, this world you live in. Harsh in ways that comfortable modernity has largely forgotten. But there's also something clarifying about it. Something that strips away pretense and reveals what truly matters. Family, warmth, food, survival. Everything else is luxury. Everything else can wait until spring. As darkness creeps across the clearing, you finish your evening chores and head inside, where the fire crackles welcomingly and the smell of apple butter mingles with wood smoke and the particular scent of a cabin full of living, breathing humans. Elizabeth has already gotten the younger children into their nightclothes. Sarah is reading aloud from the family Bible by candlelight, her voice soft and steady. You close the door against the encroaching cold, slide the wooden bar into place, and allow yourself one moment of something almost like peace. The first frost has come and gone. Winter is approaching with all its terrors, but tonight, right now, your family is warm and fed and together. Tomorrow the real work continues. The morning arrives grey and still, the kind of October dawn that seems to hold its breath, waiting for something. You've been awake for nearly an hour already, lying in the darkness of your bed, really just a wooden frame with a straw-stuffed mattress that Elizabeth restuffed just last month, listening to the sounds of a world preparing for transformation. A distant owl makes its final calls before surrendering the night to day. Something rustles in the leaves outside, probably a deer making its way to the creek for an early drink. But it's not the sounds that woke you. It's the absence of sound, specifically the absence of birdsong that should be filling these pre-dawn hours. The songbirds have been leaving steadily over the past weeks, heading south to wherever songbirds go when the cold comes. Their departure leaves behind a silence that feels almost physical, a weight pressing against your ears. You've learned to read this silence the way a sailor reads the sea. Each missing voice tells part of the story. The warblers left first, back in late September, barely waiting for the first cool nights before vanishing southward. Then the thrushes, the vireos, the tanagers, each species following some internal calendar that humans can observe but never fully understand. Now even the robins are thinning out, though a few hardy individuals always seem to linger, either brave or foolish depending on how you look at it. But it's not the departures that matter most for your predictions, it's the arrivals. Specifically, you're watching for the juncos. The dark-eyed juncos are winter birds, grey and white sprites that breed in Canada and the northern mountains before descending to lower elevations when the cold sets in. Their arrival in your clearing serves as one of nature's most reliable winter announcements. When the juncos show up, true cold follows within weeks. It's consistent enough that you've marked their arrival dates in the family almanac for 7 years running, and the pattern holds steady. This morning, as you finally rise from bed and peer through the cabin's small window, you spot them. A flock of perhaps 24 juncos has materialized in the bare branches of the oak tree at the clearing's edge, their white outer tail feathers flashing as they flit about. They weren't there yesterday. Today they are. Winter's messengers have arrived exactly on schedule. Elizabeth stirs behind you, and you hear her sharp intake of breath as she joins you at the window. She doesn't need to ask what you're looking at. She knows. "Early this year," she murmurs. She's right. Checking back through your almanac notes will confirm it. The juncos have arrived nearly 2 weeks ahead of their usual schedule. Combined with those low-flying geese, the hyperactive squirrels, and the wide-banded caterpillars, the message seems clear. Nature is bracing for something significant. Here's the thing that might surprise you about 19th century weather prediction. It wasn't all superstition and guesswork, mixed in with the genuinely useless folklore, like the idea that thunder in winter means snow within 10 days, or that if the cat sits with its back to the fire a cold snap is coming. You find observations that reflect genuine ecological knowledge accumulated over generations. Consider the persimmon seed method, which you learned from an old-timer in town who swore it predicted winter weather with 90% accuracy. You cut open a persimmon seed and examine the shape of the embryo inside. If it looks like a spoon, expect heavy snow that will require shoveling. If it looks like a fork, prepare for a mild winter with light, powdery snow. If it looks like a knife, brace for cutting winds and bitter cold. Now, does this actually work? Historians and scientists still argue whether the persimmon seed method has any predictive validity, or whether people simply interpret ambiguous shapes to match whatever they expect to see. Modern analysis suggests the seeds vary primarily based on the conditions during the growing season, rather than predicting conditions to come, similar to the woolly bear caterpillars. But the interesting thing is that in regions where summer heat strongly correlates with winter severity, the method does show some statistical validity, even if the causation runs backward from what practitioners believe. The truth is, your survival doesn't depend on perfect prediction, it depends on preparation for the worst. If the signs suggest a harsh winter, and you prepare accordingly, you lose nothing if the winter turns mild. You simply have extra supplies that carry over to next year. But if the signs suggest a harsh winter, and you dismiss them, gambling on an easier season that never arrives, well, that's how families end up burning their furniture in February. So you pay attention to everything. You watch the animals with the focused intensity of someone whose life depends on interpretation. And what you're seeing right now, in mid-October of this particular year, is a natural world that appears to be hunkering down earlier and more urgently than usual. The woolly bear caterpillars deserve more attention because their cultural significance in American folklore runs deeper than most people realize. These fuzzy, banded creatures, technically the larvae of the Isabella tiger moth, have served as winter prophets since at least the colonial period. The conventional wisdom holds that the wider the caterpillar's rusty brown middle band, the milder the coming winter. The wider the black bands at each end, the harsher the season ahead. You found an unusual specimen last week crawling across the woodpile, almost entirely black, with just a thin strip of brown barely visible in the middle. Your daughter Sarah picked it up and examined it with the serious attention of a scientist, then looked up at you with worry in her eyes. That's not good, is it? You didn't lie to her. She's old enough for truth. Means we work harder, you said. Means we make sure. The quirky thing about woolly bear predictions is that they spawned what might be America's first systematic weather folklore study. In 1948, though you won't live to see this, a scientist named Howard Curran will collect woolly bears in Bear Mountain, New York, measure their bands and publish his findings in a newspaper. His methodology is questionable, his sample size is laughable, but his study will launch a tradition that persists into the 21st century. Every October, festivals across America will celebrate the woolly bear caterpillar as a fuzzy oracle of winter weather. Whether the caterpillars actually know anything remains disputed. What's not disputed is that generations of Americans have believed they do, and that belief shaped behaviour in ways that often promoted survival. Even incorrect beliefs can have beneficial effects if they encourage preparation and caution. Back in your clearing, the day is brightening, and your children are beginning to stir. The younger ones wake like springs releasing, suddenly, noisily, with immediate demands for breakfast. Sarah emerges more slowly, already calculating the day's tasks in her head. She's turned into your best helper over the past year, old enough to understand the stakes and young enough to still have the energy that endless labour demands. Elizabeth has the fire rebuilt and the kettle heating by the time you finish your morning ablutions. Breakfast will be simple, as it always is during the preparation season, when time cannot be wasted on elaborate cooking. Cornmeal mush sweetened with a precious spoonful of maple syrup, a bit of bacon from last year's still dwindling supply, and warm milk from the morning's milking. As you eat, you run through the day's priorities aloud, partly to organise your own thoughts and partly to distribute the labour efficiently. "I'll be felling trees today," you announce. "Need 2 more down before the ground freezes too hard. Sarah, I need you splitting kindling. We're low, and the children can stack what you split. Elizabeth, how are we on candles?" "Short," she admits. "I've got tallow saved from the butchering, but I haven't had time to dip. Maybe tomorrow, if the younger ones can manage without me for a few hours." This is the constant calculation of frontier life, balancing immediate needs against future requirements, weighing today's exhaustion against winter's demands. Every hour has multiple claims upon it. Every family member, down to the youngest capable of contributing, has essential work to perform. You think about the Greens, 3 farms over, who lost their patriarch to a falling tree 2 winters back. Mr. Green was felling timber alone, something everyone knows you shouldn't do, but something everyone does anyway when there aren't enough hands and too much work, and the tree twisted as it fell, caught him across the legs. By the time his wife found him, he'd been trapped for hours in the cold, and the damage was too severe to save him. Mrs. Green and her children somehow made it through that winter and the next, but it changed them. The oldest boy, only 15, became the man of the house overnight. The whole family carries a haunted look now, the particular expression of people who know exactly how thin the line is between survival and catastrophe. You never fell trees alone, not anymore. Today you'll take Sarah with you, not to help with the cutting itself, she's not strong enough for that, but to watch, to fetch tools, and to run for help if something goes wrong. It's a precaution that costs some efficiency but might save your life. The morning passes in the particular rhythm of autumn labour. Steady, purposeful, tinged with urgency. You select your trees carefully, looking for dead or dying specimens that will burn well but won't be missed from the forest's living architecture. There's art to this selection, knowledge passed from father to son about which wood burns hottest, which sparks most, which produces the best coals for overnight banking. Oak is ideal for main heating fires, dense, slow burning, producing excellent coals that will hold through the night. Hickory burns hot and long as well, with the added benefit of producing wood suitable for smoking meat. Maple burns cleanly and splits easily, making it good for quicker fires when you need fast heat. Pine and other soft woods burn fast and spark dangerously, better suited for kindling than main fuel, though beggars can't always be choosers when February winds are howling. The tree you've selected today is a dead oak, killed by lightning 2 summers back and since dried to perfect firewood readiness. Standing dead trees like this are prized, already partially seasoned and ready to burn without the long drying period that greenwood requires. Greenwood burns poorly, produces excessive smoke, and deposits creosote in your chimney that can lead to deadly chimney fires. Another danger that modern minds rarely consider but that haunted frontier families every winter. Sarah watches as you notch the trunk, carefully cutting the directional wedge that will guide the tree's fall. She's learning by observation, storing knowledge she'll need when she has her own household to manage, her own winters to survive. You explain as you work, pointing out how the tree's lean affects your cut placement, how you watch for widowmakers, those dead branches that can break loose and fall unpredictably when a tree begins its descent. The tree falls perfectly, crashing through the underbrush exactly where you intended, and for a moment you allow yourself a small surge of satisfaction. 2 hours later, you've limbed the trunk and begun cutting it into rounds. Tomorrow you'll split these rounds into burnable pieces and haul them to the woodpile. Tonight you'll sleep with aching muscles and rough hands, but also with the knowledge that your family is slightly more prepared than they were yesterday. And in the branches above, a flock of juncos watches with the patient attention of creatures who understand, perhaps better than any human, what is coming. The harvest rush begins in earnest 3 days later, when the temperature drops sharply overnight and you wake to find ice crystallized in the water bucket you keep by the door. This isn't the delicate decorative frost of last week. This is a warning shot, a preview of killing cold to come, and it launches your family into the kind of controlled frenzy that defines autumn on the frontier. You have perhaps 2 weeks, maybe 3 if the weather holds, to bring in everything that remains in the fields and garden. After that, anything left outside will freeze solid, transforming from life-sustaining food into useless organic matter fit only for the compost pile. There is no grocery store to compensate for your failures. There is no food bank, no emergency assistance, no social safety net of any kind. What you grow, gather and preserve is what you'll have to survive on until May at the earliest. Let that sink in for a moment. From roughly November through April, 5 to 6 months depending on your location and that year's particular weather patterns, you will eat only what you've managed to store. Fresh food simply doesn't exist in winter. There are no refrigerated trucks bringing lettuce from California, no heated greenhouses producing tomatoes year-round, no global supply chain connecting your table to farms in Chile or Mexico. There is only what sits in your root cellar, hangs in your smokehouse, and lines the shelves of your cabin. This reality shapes everything about the harvest rush. Every potato matters. Every cabbage head represents calories that might mean the difference between survival and starvation in March. Every jar of preserved beans, every barrel of sauerkraut, every string of dried apples hanging from the rafters carries weight far beyond its physical mass. Your children understand this. even the younger ones, though their understanding is more instinctive than intellectual. They've absorbed the urgency through observation, through the way their parents' voices tightened during harvest season, through the way play is postponed and sleep is shortened and every waking hour is devoted to bringing in the crops. The morning of the big push, you gather everyone before the sun clears the tree line. Your wife has prepared a substantial breakfast. You'll need the fuel, and now you're assigning tasks with the precision of a military commander deploying troops. Sarah, you're with me on the potato field. We need to get them all today. I don't trust tomorrow's weather. Boys, you're on carrots and turnips. Pull everything, even the small ones, and pile them by the cellar door. Don't wash them. We'll brush off the dirt when we store them. Elizabeth, can you handle the cabbages? She nods, already tying back her hair and reaching for her heavy work apron. I'll get the little ones started on gathering the last beans first. Won't take long, there's not much left on the vines. The little ones in question are your two youngest, Thomas, who's 7, and Emma, just turned 5. They're not capable of heavy labour yet, but they can contribute, and they're expected to. Childhood on the frontier looks very different from childhood in the 21st century. There is no coddling, no protection from hard work, no sense that children should be shielded from adult responsibilities. Everyone works because everyone must, and children who grow up working generally survive to produce children of their own. This might sound harsh to modern ears, and in some ways it is. Child labour on 19th century farms could be dangerous, exhausting, and psychologically taxing. Injuries were common. Childhood, in the sense of a protected period of play and learning free from productive obligations, essentially didn't exist for farm families. Historians still argue whether this should be viewed as simple necessity, cultural cruelty, or something more nuanced that defies easy moral categorization. But there's another perspective worth considering. Children who contribute meaningfully to their family's survival develop competence, confidence, and a sense of purpose that many modern children lack. They understand, viscerally, that their actions matter, that pulling those carrots isn't just busy work assigned to keep them occupied, but an essential task that will keep everyone fed through the cold months ahead. There's dignity in that, even if there's also hardship. Little Emma takes her carrot-pulling duties with extraordinary seriousness, and watching her tiny hands work the orange roots free from the dark soil is one of those moments that makes all the exhaustion worthwhile. She's too young to articulate why this matters, but she knows it does, and she applies herself with focused intensity. The potato field is your primary concern today. Potatoes are the backbone of winter survival in northern climates, calorie-dense, long storing, versatile enough to prepare in countless ways. A good potato harvest can be the difference between a family that thrives through winter and one that merely survives. A failed potato harvest can be catastrophic. You think about the Irish, who even now are suffering through the worst of the Great Famine caused by potato blight. Refugees from that disaster have been arriving in American ports for 2 years, bringing with them stories of starvation, disease and death on a scale that's difficult to comprehend. The blight hasn't reached your area, yet. But the news serves as a constant reminder that agricultural abundance is never guaranteed, that the food systems humans depend upon are more fragile than they appear. Your potatoes look healthy this year, thank God. You've been checking them obsessively since August, examining leaves for the telltale black spots that signal blight infection, digging test holes to inspect the tubers themselves. So far so good. But you won't breathe easy until they're safely stored in the root cellar with inches of straw between them and the world. Sarah works beside you, her movements efficient from years of practice. You dig with a spading fork, loosening the soil and lifting the potato plants with their clusters of attached tubers. She follows behind, gathering the potatoes into baskets, brushing off the worst of the dirt and sorting them by size. Large potatoes go in one basket for eating, medium potatoes go in another for both eating and possible seed stock. Small potatoes go in a third for immediate cooking since they won't store as well. It's monotonous work, the kind that empties your mind while filling your body with a pleasant sort of exhaustion. Fork, lift, shake, move on. Fork, lift, shake, move on. The rhythm becomes almost meditative, and despite the urgency you find yourself settling into a peaceful state where nothing exists except the next plant, the next cluster of tubers, the next step forward in the row. By noon, you've cleared perhaps a third of the potato field, and your back is already complaining. You're not as young as you once were, 37 years old, which feels ancient out here where hard labour ages bodies faster than calendars suggest. And the constant bending takes its toll. Sarah runs to the cabin and returns with bread, cheese and cold water, and you sit together at the field's edge for a brief rest. "Will we finish today?" she asks, eyeing the remaining rows with calculation. "We'll finish today," you confirm, making it a statement of determination rather than prediction. "We have to finish today." She nods, understanding completely, and finishes her bread in efficient bites before returning to work. Here's something that might surprise you. The harvest rush wasn't solely about bringing in your own crops. It was also about community coordination that modern supply chains have made obsolete. Throughout October, farming families engaged in a complex web of trading and sharing that distributed different crops and skills across the community. Your neighbour to the west, the Johnsons, are exceptional apple growers but terrible with root vegetables. Something about their soil, perhaps, or maybe just lack of attention to the techniques. Your neighbour to the east, the Millers, raise the best pigs in the county but have limited pasturage and always seem short on hay. These imbalances create natural opportunities for exchange. Your surplus potatoes for the Johnson's apple butter, your extra hay for a share of the Miller's pork. This trading happens informally, without contracts or formal accounting, based on relationships built over years of mutual dependence. You helped the Millers raise their barn last summer. They'll help you slaughter your hog next month. The Johnsons brought food when Elizabeth was recovering from the last pregnancy. You'll bring firewood when old Mr. Johnson's back gives out, which it does every winter. Historians describe this system as a moral economy, an economic arrangement based on social obligations and community values, rather than pure market exchange. It's less efficient than modern capitalism in some technical sense, but it's also more resilient. When one family has a disaster, the community absorbs the shock. When one crop fails, others compensate. The web of mutual obligation creates a safety net that, while imperfect, often means the difference between a family's survival and their destruction. The afternoon grows long, and the shadows stretch across the potato field as you approach the final rows. Your back has passed through pain into a numb acceptance that you'll probably regret tomorrow. Sarah looks exhausted, but she hasn't complained once, and you feel a surge of pride in this daughter who works like an adult while still being, in so many ways, a child. The last potato comes out of the ground just as the sun touches the western tree line. You stand slowly, joints popping in protest, and survey the baskets lined up at the field's edge. It's a good harvest, better than last year when late blight struck in September and you lost nearly a quarter of the crop. This year, luck and careful attention have combined to produce abundance. Now comes the storing, which is almost as important as the harvesting itself. Improperly stored potatoes will rot, sprout or freeze, transforming precious food into useless waste. You've learned the techniques through trial and error, through advice from older farmers, through the accumulated wisdom of generations who discovered what works by suffering when it didn't. The root cellar beckons, dark and cool and smelling of earth and apples and the particular mustiness of vegetables slowly breathing in the underground dark. Tomorrow, you'll begin the careful process of arranging this harvest for maximum preservation. Tonight, you'll eat a hot meal, fall into bed with aching muscles, and sleep the deep sleep of physical exhaustion. The harvest rush continues tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, until everything that can be saved has been saved, and everything that can be stored has been stored. Winter is coming, but first there's work to do. The hog hangs from the gambrel, steam rising from its opened carcass into the cold November morning, and you stand before it with your butchering knife trying to remember everything your father taught you about this moment. This is the culmination of months of labour. Feeding the animal, housing the animal, fattening the animal on scraps and acorns and whatever else you could provide, all leading to this single day when the hog becomes food that will sustain your family through the darkness ahead. The killing happened at dawn, quick and professional, because you've learned that a frightened animal produces inferior meat. Something about the stress, the chemistry of fear flooding through muscle tissue, affecting texture and taste and keeping quality. So you approached your hog with the same calm demeanour you'd use approaching a friend, fed it a special treat of old bread soaked in milk, and while it ate contentedly, you did what needed doing with a single precise blow. The animal was dead before it could register surprise. This is the stark reality that modern supermarket packaging carefully conceals. Meat comes from living creatures that must be killed, and until quite recently in human history, most families did their own killing. The bacon you might fry up for breakfast, the ham you might glaze for a holiday dinner, the sausages sizzling in a pan, all of these were once animals that someone raised, slaughtered and butchered by hand. It's not a pleasant reality, but it's an honest one, and frontier families approached it with pragmatic acceptance rather than sentimentality. The hog served its purpose while alive, and now it will serve its purpose in death. The alternative, forgoing meat through the winter, is not really an alternative at all for families who need the protein, calories, and fat that meat provides. Your neighbour Robert Miller has come to help with the butchering, as you helped with his butchering 2 weeks ago. This is how it works. Families stagger their slaughter days so neighbours can assist each other, sharing labour and expertise and making the massive task manageable. Robert is better with the finer knife work, trimming joints, separating cuts, slicing bacon sides to uniform thickness, while your strength serves better for the heavy work of halving the carcass and breaking it into primals. Elizabeth and the Miller women work nearby at a makeshift outdoor station, processing the parts that require immediate attention. The intestines need cleaning for sausage casings, a thoroughly unpleasant job that involves scraping, washing and soaking until what was recently part of the animal's digestive system becomes clean tubes suitable for stuffing. The liver, heart and kidneys need quick cooking or preserving before they spoil. The blood caught during slaughter in a large basin will become blood sausage, a delicacy to some, an unappetizing necessity to others. Nothing is wasted. This is perhaps the most striking difference between 19th century butchering and modern meat processing. The absolute insistence that every part of the animal serves some purpose. The head will be roasted or boiled, its meat picked and combined with seasonings to make head cheese. The feet will become pickled pig's feet, an acquired taste but an excellent source of gelatin and nutrients. The fat will be rendered into lard, an essential cooking medium and ingredient for everything from pie crusts to soap. Even the bones will be boiled for broth before being fed to the dogs or added to the garden's compost heap. The preservation process begins immediately, because fresh pork spoils quickly even in cold weather. Different cuts demand different treatments based on size, fat content, and intended use. The hams, the rear legs, are the most valuable cuts and receive the most careful attention. You've prepared a salt mixture with brown sugar, saltpeter, and black pepper, following a recipe that your family has used for 3 generations. Each ham gets a thorough rubbing, the salt mixture pressed into every surface and crevice, then placed in a barrel and covered with more salt. They'll cure for roughly 6 weeks, the salt drawing moisture out and creating an environment hostile to spoilage bacteria before being removed, washed, and hung in the smokehouse for the final phase of preservation. The bacon sides receive similar treatment, though their thinner profile means shorter curing time. The shoulders get salted and will become various preparations depending on your family's needs. Some smoked, some pickled, some simply kept under salt for extended preservation. Here's a quirky detail that might surprise you. Saltpeter, or potassium nitrate, was an essential component of traditional meat curing, and it's the same compound used in making gunpowder. Families understood that saltpeter did something important during curing. Meat treated with it stayed pink and developed that characteristic cured flavour, but nobody knew exactly why until the 20th century, when scientists identified its role in preventing botulism and creating nitric oxide that reacts with meat proteins. The quirky thing is that saltpeter usage for meat curing predates any understanding of its mechanism by centuries. Generations of families used it because it worked, passing down the knowledge purely on practical grounds. This is true of many traditional preservation techniques. They developed through trial and error, persisted because they produced good results, and only received scientific explanation long after they became standard practice. Historians still argue about the origins of smoke preservation. Some evidence suggests smoking meat dates back to the Paleolithic era, making it one of humanity's oldest food technologies. The mechanism involves multiple factors: dehydration, antimicrobial compounds in smoke, surface pH changes, that work together to create an inhospitable environment for spoilage organisms while adding distinctive flavour. But the smoke serves another purpose too. It creates a protective layer on the meat's surface that helps prevent insect infestation, a critical consideration in the days before window screens and refrigeration. Your smokehouse sits 50 feet from the cabin, a small building perhaps 8 feet square constructed of weathered oak boards with a packed dirt floor. A fire pit at the centre provides the heat and smoke, venting through a small cupola at the peak of the roof. The key to successful smoking lies in temperature control. Too hot and you cook the meat, too cool and you don't get adequate smoke circulation. The ideal is a steady smoulder, just hot enough to keep the smoke flowing but never approaching cooking temperatures. The process takes weeks. Fresh cured hams go into the smokehouse after their initial salting period and remain there for anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 months, depending on their size, the weather, and personal preference. During this time, someone must tend the fire constantly, adding hardwood chips when needed, adjusting airflow through the vents, monitoring the meat's progress with the experienced eye that only practice develops. You'll be burning hickory, mostly, because that's what grows abundantly in your area, and because hickory smoke imparts a particular flavour that your family has grown to associate with properly cured meat. But you know families who swear by applewood for a sweeter smoke, oak for a heavier flavour, or cherry for something in between. The variations are regional, familial, personal, part of the invisible cultural heritage that defines different communities even when they live similar lives. The sausage making begins in the afternoon, once the initial butchering chaos has settled into organised work. Sausage is peasant food in the best sense of the term. It transforms scraps and trimmings that might otherwise be difficult to use into preserved, portable, flavourful packages of nutrition. The grinding is tedious work, feeding chunks of fatty pork through a hand-cranked grinder that reduces them to coarse meal, but the stuffing is almost festive, a task that involves the whole family working in assembly line fashion. Robert Miller's wife has brought her special sausage seasoning mixture, a closely guarded family recipe that she finally shared with Elizabeth last winter after extracting promises of secrecy. It involves sage, of course, and black pepper and something else, perhaps a hint of mace, that gives the finished sausage an indefinable rightness. Every family has their own variations, their own secret ingredients, their own traditions around sausage making that stretch back generations to the old countries their ancestors left behind. The casings, cleaned and soaked until they're pliable, slide onto the stuffing horn, and then comes the rhythmic work of grinding, stuffing, twisting the casings into links, and hanging them to dry. Fresh sausage will keep for perhaps a week in cold weather. Dried sausage, properly smoked and stored, can last for months. You'll make both, the fresh sausage for immediate eating, and the dried for later winter, when fresh food becomes a distant memory. By nightfall, the butchering is essentially complete. The carcass that hung steaming this morning has been transformed into organised piles and barrels and strings of preservation, hams in their curing barrels, bacon sides similarly packed, sausages hanging in loops, organ meats already cooked or preserved, fat rendered into crocks of creamy white lard. The dogs have received their share, bones and scraps too small to be worth processing, and even they seem exhausted from the day's excitement. Your family will eat well tonight. Fresh liver fried with onions, a traditional butchering day meal that celebrates the abundance of the moment before the long work of preservation truly begins. Robert Miller's family joins yours for dinner, crowded around the table that barely fits everyone, sharing food and fellowship and the particular satisfaction that comes from accomplishing difficult work together. Tomorrow the smokehouse fire will begin its weeks-long vigil. Tomorrow more preservation tasks will demand attention, but tonight, with full bellies and tired bodies, and the security of knowing that meat will carry your family through the winter, you allow yourself a moment of gratitude. The hog served its purpose well. Now its transformation into survival continues. The root cellar door is heavy, deliberately so, designed to provide insulation against both summer heat and winter cold. You lift it now in the grey November light, revealing the wooden stairs that descend into darkness, and pause for a moment to let your eyes adjust before climbing down into the cool, earthy dimness below. This is your family's vault, the underground treasury where summer's abundance must last until spring returns. The smell hits you first, that particular combination of soil and straw and stored vegetables that defines root cellars everywhere, slightly musty but not unpleasant. The smell of careful preservation and patient waiting. Then your eyes begin to distinguish shapes, the shelving along the walls, the bins on the floor, the hanging baskets suspended from the ceiling joists. You built this root cellar 3 summers ago, digging into the north-facing hillside behind the cabin until you'd excavated a space roughly 12 feet by 8 feet, shoring the walls with fieldstone and covering the ceiling with heavy timbers before mounding dirt back over the top. The labour was tremendous. Your back still remembers those weeks of shoveling, but the result is a space that stays naturally cool in summer and naturally above freezing in winter, the ideal conditions for long-term vegetable storage. The siting matters enormously. You chose the north-facing slope deliberately because it receives less direct sunlight, staying cooler through the warm months. The hillside location means the cellar is surrounded on 3 sides by earth, which provides natural insulation and maintains stable temperatures regardless of what's happening above ground. You've seen cellars built in the wrong locations, south-facing or in low spots where water collects, and watched families lose their stored vegetables to heat spoilage or flooding. Temperature and humidity control form the twin pillars of successful root cellar storage. Most root vegetables want cold but not freezing, ideally between 32 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit, with relatively high humidity to prevent drying and shriveling. But different vegetables have different requirements, and part of the art lies in creating microclimates within the cellar that serve different crops' needs. Your potatoes, for instance, want darkness above all else. Any light exposure causes them to develop green spots and the toxic compound solanine. You've stored them in the darkest corner, in wooden bins covered with burlap sacking, with straw between layers to promote air circulation and prevent bruising. They'll keep well into spring if conditions hold, providing the caloric backbone of your winter diet. Carrots and turnips occupy another section, packed in damp sand that maintains humidity around their roots, while preventing direct vegetable-to-vegetable contact that could spread rot. You've learned to inspect them regularly, removing any specimens that show signs of decay before the problem spreads. One rotten carrot left undetected can ruin dozens of its neighbours through the mysterious alchemy of decomposition. Apples present a particular challenge that you've only recently figured out. They need to be stored separately from other produce because they release ethylene gas, a ripening hormone that accelerates spoilage in nearby vegetables. This is the knowledge that historians argue about, whether frontier families understood the mechanism or simply observed the effect and adapted. You don't care which it is. You only care that your cabbages lasted 2 months longer once you started keeping apples on the opposite side of the cellar. Your cabbages hang from the ceiling joists, suspended by their root balls in a technique your wife learned from German settlers who arrived in the area a decade ago. The Germans know things about sauerkraut and cabbage storage that English-speaking families are only beginning to appreciate. Fermentation techniques that transform simple cabbage into a vitamin-rich superfood that prevents the scurvy, which still threatens families who rely too heavily on grain and meat. The sauerkraut crock sits in its own corner, a large ceramic vessel filled with shredded cabbage, salt, and thyme. You packed it 3 weeks ago, pounding the salted cabbage with a wooden mallet until the juices flowed, then weighting the mass down with a clean stone to keep everything submerged. The fermentation happens slowly, invisibly, lactic acid bacteria transforming the cabbage's sugars into preservative acids that will keep the kraut edible until next summer while creating vitamin C that your bodies desperately need. Here's something that might surprise you. Scurvy remained a genuine threat to frontier families well into the 19th century. Without access to fresh fruits and vegetables for months at a time, without understanding of vitamin requirements, families could and did develop the bleeding gums, loose teeth, and general debilitation that characterize vitamin C deficiency. The families who fared best were often those who, like your German neighbours, maintained fermentation traditions that preserved vitamins along with calories. Beets occupy another bin, layered with sawdust to maintain separation and airflow. Parsnips share space nearby. They're actually improved by frost, converting starches to sugars in response to cold, which is why you left them in the ground until well after the first freeze before digging them for storage. Onions hang in braids from a ceiling hook, their papery skins rustling slightly whenever you move through the cellar, creating enough airflow to disturb their rest. Winter squash, butternut, acorn and Hubbard varieties sits on the higher shelves where the temperature stays slightly warmer. Unlike root vegetables, squash wants dryness rather than humidity, and the higher storage prevents moisture from collecting on their shells. You've seen squash stored improperly turn to mush within weeks. Stored correctly, they'll keep until March or beyond. The quirky truth about root cellar science is that much of it was discovered through disaster. Families learned about ethylene gas not through chemical analysis, but through watching their vegetables spoil when stored with apples. They learned about humidity requirements by observing which storage methods produced shriveled, unusable produce. Every technique in your arsenal represents some ancestor's failure transformed into wisdom through painful experience. You conduct your inspection methodically, the routine now second nature after years of practice. Each bin gets examined, each vegetable checked for soft spots or mould or the distinctive smell of decay. You find one carrot showing signs of rot and remove it immediately, checking its neighbours for spreading damage. Everything else looks good, healthy, firm, ready to sustain your family through whatever the winter brings. The quantities seem adequate, though adequate is always a guess. You estimate roughly 200 pounds of potatoes, 50 pounds of carrots, 30 pounds of turnips, 40 cabbages including the kraut in progress, a bushel of beets, a similar quantity of parsnips, and maybe 30 winter squash of various sizes. Add in the dried beans in the cabin, the corn waiting to be ground into meal, the preserved fruits and jams and jellies Elizabeth has put up, and your family should have enough. Should. There's that word again. The hedging term that reveals the uncertainty underlying all frontier calculations. Variables beyond your control could change everything. A harsh winter that lasts longer than expected. Unexpected illness requiring extra nourishment. Spoilage that claims more stored food than anticipated. You've done everything possible to prepare, but everything possible never feels like quite enough. You climb back up the stairs into the grey daylight, lowering the heavy door carefully behind you. The mounded earth over the cellar looks like an oversized grave, a comparison you try not to dwell on, but it's actually the opposite. A repository of life, a storehouse of survival, a bulwark against the death that winter threatens. Your children are playing near the barn, taking advantage of this mild November afternoon that might be one of the last comfortable outdoor days until spring. You watch them for a moment, these small humans whose lives depend on your planning and preparation and labour, and feel the weight of that responsibility settle more heavily on your shoulders. The root cellar is full, the smokehouse is working, the firewood pile is adequate. But winter hasn't truly arrived yet, and you know from experience that the real test lies ahead, in the months when cold and darkness and isolation test everything you've built. For now, you'll take this moment of relative peace. There will be work enough tomorrow, and the day after, and every day until spring. But right now, watching your children chase each other across the frost-hardened meadow, you can almost believe that everything will be fine. Almost. The axe bites into oak with a satisfying thunk, and you twist the handle to free the blade before swinging again. This is the rhythm that will define your autumn days from now until the ground freezes solid. Swing, bite, twist, repeat. Swing, bite, twist, repeat. The woodpile grows log by log, the only measure of progress that truly matters as winter approaches. 10 cords of firewood. That's the traditional estimate for a family your size in a climate like yours. Cold enough for snow from November through March, with temperatures that can plunge well below zero during the worst cold snaps. 10 cords sounds like an abstract number until you start calculating what it actually means. A cord of firewood measures 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long, containing roughly 128 cubic feet of wood. But that measurement includes the air spaces between logs, so the actual wood content is closer to 80 or 90 cubic feet, depending on how neatly you stack. A cord of dense hardwood like oak weighs roughly 2 tons, so 10 cords represent something like 20 tons of material that must be felled, cut, split, hauled and stacked before the snow flies. 20 tons by hand with axe, saw and wedge. Let that sink in as you settle into your bed tonight. Every family on the frontier faced this calculation, this back-breaking requirement that consumed more labour hours than any other single task of frontier life. Historians estimate that a reasonably strong man working steadily could produce perhaps half a cord per day under good conditions, meaning that simply producing enough firewood for winter required 40 to 50 full days of hard labour, not counting the felling, hauling and stacking. And here's the thing, you can't just cut wood as you need it. Green wood, freshly cut, contains enough moisture that it burns poorly, produces excessive smoke and deposits creosote in your chimney at a dangerous rate. Ideally, firewood should season for at least 6 months before burning, which means that the wood you burn this winter was actually cut last spring, and the wood you're cutting now is for next winter. You're always working year ahead, always playing a long game that requires planning and foresight that modern convenience has made obsolete. The standing dead oak you found last week was a gift precisely because it was already seasoned, ready to burn without the waiting period, but such finds are lucky exceptions. Most of your woodcutting involves green timber that must cure for months before it becomes useful fuel. Your technique has improved over the years, but it's still brutal work. You fell the tree with axe and crosscut saw, the two-man saw that requires a partner on the other end, often Sarah or Elizabeth when they can be spared from other tasks. Then you limb the trunk, removing branches that become kindling or small diameter fuel. The trunk gets bucked into rounds, each one roughly the length of your fireplace or stove, and finally the rounds get split into manageable pieces using axe, sledgehammer and steel wedges. The splitting is almost meditative when it goes well, finding the grain lines, positioning the wedge just so, striking with enough force to drive the wedge through, but not so much that it sticks fast in the wood. A well-split round opens like a book, falling cleanly into halves that can be quartered and quartered again until you have pieces sized for efficient burning. But when it goes poorly, knotted wood that resists every approach, grain patterns that send the axe glancing off at dangerous angles, the work becomes frustrating and hazardous. Robert Miller lost 3 fingers to a glancing axe blow 2 winters back. The blade deflected off a hidden knot and took his fingers clean off at the middle joints. His wife stopped the bleeding with a tourniquet and cauterization, heated metal pressed against the wounds until they sealed, and he survived. But those fingers are gone forever, a permanent reminder of how quickly things can go wrong. Here's a quirky detail that frontier families understood, but modern people often don't. Different woods burn very differently, and matching the wood to the purpose matters enormously for efficiency and safety. Oak is king for heating fires. Dense, slow burning, producing excellent coals that hold heat through the night, oak is what you want in your fireplace during a February cold snap. A properly banked oak fire can maintain survivable temperatures for 8 or 10 hours without attention, allowing your family to sleep through the night without someone waking to feed the flames. Hickory burns similarly hot and slow, with the added advantage of splitting more easily than oak. If you could choose your ideal fuel, you might go with hickory for the labour savings alone, but you burn what grows nearby, and in your area, oak predominates. Maple is good middle ground wood, not as dense as oak or hickory, but still reasonably slow burning and producing decent coals. Ash burns surprisingly well even when green, making it valuable for emergency fuel when seasoned wood runs short. Elm is nightmarish to split, its interlocked grain defeating wedges and axes alike, but burns adequately if you can somehow get it into burnable pieces. The softwoods, pine, fir, spruce, cedar, burn fast and hot, producing intense flames but poor coals. They're good for starting fires, good for quick cooking heat, but terrible for overnight heating. They also produce far more creosote than hardwoods, coating your chimney with flammable deposits that can ignite into a chimney fire, one of the most feared disasters of frontier life. Historians still argue about how frontier families learned these distinctions. Some knowledge certainly came from European traditions, carried over by settlers who already understood their local trees and applied that understanding to similar American species. Other knowledge was surely Native American in origin, passed to colonists through trade and interaction, before being absorbed into general settler culture. And much was simply rediscovered through trial and error, as families learned the hard way that pine sparks dangerously while oak smoulders safely. You've found a rhythm now, splitting rounds into quarters, quarters into eighths, building a pile of fresh split wood that your children will stack against the cabin's north wall. The stacking isn't arbitrary either. You've learned to place the bark side upward on each piece, creating thousands of tiny shingles that shed rain and snow rather than absorbing it. Wet wood is nearly as bad as green wood for burning purposes, and a woodpile that absorbs moisture throughout the winter becomes progressively less useful. The location matters too. You stack against the north wall for 2 reasons. First, the north wall receives the least direct sunlight, reducing the freeze-thaw cycles that can rot exposed wood. Second, the mass of the woodpile itself provides additional insulation for the cabin, creating a windbreak that reduces heat loss through the wall it protects. These small efficiencies add up over a long winter. Sarah has joined you now, working the other end of the cross-cut saw as you buck another fallen trunk into rounds. The saw makes its characteristic singing sound as you find your rhythm. Push-pull, push-pull, the blade flexing slightly with each stroke as sawdust accumulates in the growing kerf. It's partnership work, requiring coordination and communication, and you've done it enough times now that words are unnecessary. You simply move together, the saw becoming an extension of your combined effort. The pile grows. Round by round, split piece by split piece, your insurance against winter's cold accumulates into visible security. You've passed 9 cords now, approaching the 10-cord minimum that tradition demands, and you feel the particular satisfaction of watching adequate become comfortable, become perhaps even abundant. But there's still the hauling to consider. Much of this wood lies where it was cut, scattered across the woodlot in piles that still need transport to the cabin. You've been using the horse and a simple wooden sled, what some call a stone boat, to drag loads across the ground, but the work is slow and the horse is old and every trip risks equipment failure or animal injury. Tomorrow you'll haul. Today you'll cut and split until the light fails. The woodpile demands its tribute of labour, and you pay willingly, knowing that each swing of the axe is an investment in your family's survival. Swing, bite, twist, repeat. The rhythm continues as the sun arcs overhead and begins its descent toward another early winter sunset. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker hammers against a dead trunk, finding its own rhythm in the dying forest. You and the bird are engaged in the same essential task: preparation, storage, readiness for the cold months ahead. Neither of you can afford to stop. The wind finds every crack. That's the first law of frontier construction, the immutable truth that every cabin dweller learns within their first winter. No matter how carefully you build, the wind finds every crack, every gap, every tiny opening where warmth can escape and cold can invade. Your ongoing battle against these intrusions will never end, only pause between assaults. You're applying new chinking this afternoon, working your way along the cabin's north wall where last winter's repairs have failed. Chinking is the material that fills the gaps between logs, traditionally a mixture of clay, lime and sand, though every family has their preferred recipe and technique. Yours involves local clay dug from the creek bank, mixed with dried grass for binding, and a bit of wood ash that seems to help with durability, though you're not entirely sure why. The process is simple but tedious. You press the mixture into the gaps with your fingers, smoothing it flat against the log surfaces, building up multiple thin layers rather than one thick application. Thick applications crack as they dry. Thin layers cure more evenly and last longer. It's the kind of knowledge that takes failures to learn, and you've had plenty of failures over the years. Elizabeth works beside you, her smaller fingers better suited for the detail work along the window frame, where the logs meet the precious glass pane. The window itself is a vulnerability. Glass conducts cold far more readily than wood or clay, but the light it provides is worth the heat loss. You've seen cabins with no windows at all, dark and claustrophobic spaces where winter felt like imprisonment. Your single window, small though it is, provides connection to the outside world that keeps sanity intact through the long, dark months. The chinking is only part of your draft-stopping strategy. Inside the cabin, you've hung heavy blankets over the window at night, creating a dead-air space that reduces heat transmission. The door receives similar treatment, a thick curtain of pieced wool scraps that falls in front of the actual door, adding another layer of insulation where cold tries hardest to invade. The floor gets a covering of woven rag rugs that insulate your feet from the cold ground radiating through the wooden boards. Here's something that might surprise you. The cabin design itself represents generations of accumulated wisdom about cold weather construction. The log cabin, which Americans often think of as uniquely frontier, actually derives from Scandinavian building traditions brought to the Delaware Valley by Swedish and Finnish settlers in the 17th century. These northern Europeans knew cold. They knew what worked and what didn't, and their knowledge spread across the American frontier because it worked so well in similar climates. The key principles are deceptively simple. First, mass. The thick log walls absorb heat during the day and radiate it back at night, moderating temperature swings far better than thin wall construction could manage. Second, earth contact. Setting the foundation logs directly on the ground, or better yet partially into the ground, takes advantage of the Earth's constant temperature as a heat reservoir. Third, minimal openings. Every door and window is a potential weakness in your thermal envelope, so frontier cabins typically featured only what was absolutely necessary. One door, perhaps one or two small windows, and a chimney opening. The chimney deserves special attention because it's simultaneously your greatest source of heat and your greatest source of heat loss. The fire in your fireplace produces warmth that radiates into the room, but it also creates a powerful draft that pulls warm air up the chimney and draws cold air into the cabin through every crack and opening. On very cold nights, a roaring fire can actually make a drafty cabin colder by accelerating this air exchange. Historians still argue about when frontier families figured out more efficient heating methods. The Franklin stove, invented by Benjamin Franklin in 1742, addressed some of these problems by extracting more heat from the same amount of fuel, but the technology spread slowly across the frontier. Your family relies on a traditional open fireplace, less efficient but simpler to build and maintain, supplemented by techniques that maximize the heat you can capture. Your fireplace features a reflector, a curved metal sheet positioned to bounce heat back into the room, rather than letting it escape up the chimney. You've also learned to build fires toward the back of the firebox, allowing the brick mass to absorb heat and radiate it for hours after the fire dies down. And you practice the art of banking, covering hot coals with ash to slow their burn overnight, maintaining enough heat to restart easily in the morning without wasting fuel. The craft of staying warm in a pioneer cabin extended beyond construction into the realm of sleeping arrangements. Your family sleeps in 2 beds, one for you and Elizabeth, one for the children, who pile together for shared warmth in a way that modern children with their individual rooms might find intolerable, but that frontier children accepted as normal. The beds themselves are positioned as far from the north wall as possible, as close to the fireplace as safety allows, taking advantage of radiant heat while avoiding the cold that bleeds through even well-chinked walls. Bedding is heavy, layers upon layers of quilts and blankets that Elizabeth and her mother made over years of patient stitching. The quilts serve double duty. Warmth, certainly, but also creative expression and community building. The patterns carry names and stories: log cabin, flying geese, wedding ring, and many were assembled at quilting bees where women gathered to work together, share news, and maintain the social connections that isolation otherwise threatens. Beneath the quilts, you sleep on mattresses stuffed with corn husks or straw, materials that provide some insulation from below, but that must be regularly restuffed as they compact and lose loft. The rustling of these mattresses is one of the distinctive sounds of frontier sleeping, a whispered accompaniment to every shift and turn through the long winter nights. And still, despite all these preparations, you will be cold. Not the mild discomfort of a slightly chilly room, but bone-deep cold that makes your joints ache and your muscles tense. On the worst nights, you'll wake to find frost on the interior walls, your breath visible in the firelight, the water bucket frozen solid despite being kept beside the hearth. You'll pull children closer, add another blanket, feed the fire with shaking hands, and wait for dawn. This is the reality that all your preparation confronts but cannot entirely defeat. Frontier cabins were cold in ways that modern, climate-controlled life has made almost incomprehensible. Temperatures inside a well-maintained cabin might stay just above freezing on a mild night, but on severe nights, when the fire burned low and the wind found every crack, indoor temperatures could drop to the 20s or teens. The children adapted as children do. They don't remember anything different, so this cold is simply their normal. Unpleasant, certainly, but not traumatic. They know to keep their clothes ready beside the bed for quick dressing, to sleep with caps on their heads where most body heat escapes, to accept the morning ritual of huddling near the fire while the cabin slowly warms. These adaptations are survival skills disguised as routine. You finish the chinking work as the light fades, stepping back to examine your repairs with a critical eye. The clay mixture is smooth and even, filling gaps that were letting winter infiltrate your home. It's temporary. All chinking is temporary, requiring annual maintenance against the constant assault of freeze and thaw, but it will do for now. Inside, Elizabeth has the fire built up and dinner nearly ready. The cabin feels warm, welcoming, a sanctuary against the darkness gathering outside. You know this warmth is fragile, maintained only through constant effort, but in this moment you choose to simply enjoy it. Winter is coming, but tonight your family is warm. You're wearing 4 layers this morning and you can still feel the cold. The first layer against your skin is your wool union suit, that all-in-one undergarment that frontier families depended upon, worn from October through April without removal except for the rare winter bathing. Over that comes a flannel shirt, then a wool vest, then your heavy work coat. Your legs wear similar layering, wool long johns, heavy trousers, and sometimes a second pair of trousers over those when conditions demand. This is the uniform of winter survival, and understanding its logic reveals much about how frontier families coped with cold that would incapacitate unprepared modern bodies. Wool dominates, because wool has properties no other natural fibre can match. It retains warmth even when wet, crucial in a world where sweat from labour and moisture from weather were constant threats to body heat. It regulates temperature naturally, providing warmth in cold conditions while allowing breathability that prevents dangerous overheating during physical work. And it resists odour better than alternatives like cotton or linen, a practical consideration given that winter bathing range from rare to non-existent. The union suit specifically deserves attention because it represents the base layer that made winter survival possible. This one-piece garment, typically featuring a buttoned front and a famous rear flap for necessary functions, eliminated gaps where cold could reach skin. The continuous fabric from ankle to neck created a sealed thermal layer that individual shirt and pants combinations couldn't achieve. You practically lived in your union suit during winter months, sleeping in it, working in it, eating in it, a second skin that you might not remove for weeks at a time. Here's a quirky detail that might amuse you. The union suit's name has nothing to do with the Civil War or political unions. It refers instead to the union of shirt and pants into a single garment, a simple descriptive term that captured the design's essential innovation. The garment became so associated with frontier and rural life that it persisted well into the 20th century, evolving eventually into the thermal underwear and base layers that outdoor athletes still rely upon today. Your hands present a constant challenge. They need protection from cold, but also dexterity for work that mittens make impossible. You've developed a system, wool fingerless gloves worn underneath leatherwork gloves, allowing you to remove the outer layer for fine work while maintaining some warmth. But your fingers still ache by midday, and the chilblains that develop every winter, itchy, swollen patches where cold has damaged your skin, have become simply another discomfort you accept as normal. Your feet stay warmer thanks to footwear that, while crude by modern standards, works remarkably well for its purpose. Heavy leather boots, hand-stitched by the cobbler in town, cover wool socks that Elizabeth knits throughout the year in anticipation of winter's demands. You often wear 2 pairs of socks, the inner pair for warmth and the outer pair for cushioning against the boot's rough interior. Even so, you know families who've lost toes to frostbite, and you watch for the telltale numbness that signals danger. The children have their own layering challenges. They grow constantly, which means last year's coat doesn't fit and this year's coat won't fit next year. Elizabeth performs miracles of alteration and reconstruction, letting out seams, adding panels, repurposing adult garments into child-size protection. Nothing is wasted. A worn-out coat becomes patches for a better coat, becomes eventually the stuffing for a quilt, becomes eventually the rags that clean up spills. The life cycle of fabric on the frontier traced a long, slow arc, from new cloth to final dissolution. Staying warm required not just proper clothing, but proper management of that clothing throughout the day. The danger, perhaps counterintuitively, was often overheating rather than underheating, at least during work hours. Heavy physical labour produces tremendous body heat, and layering that's appropriate for standing still becomes dangerously sweaty during exertion. Wet clothing loses most of its insulating value, and sweat that soaks through your layers can freeze when you stop working, leading to rapid and dangerous heat loss. So you learn to manage your layers dynamically. Before starting vigorous work, you remove your outer coat, perhaps your vest as well. As you warm up, you might push up your sleeves, unbutton your shirt, allow excess heat to escape before it becomes trapped sweat. When you stop for rest, you immediately add layers back, even if you don't feel cold yet, because by the time you feel cold, you've already lost dangerous amounts of body heat. The Fireside rotation deserves special mention because it was one of the more ingenious adaptations to cabin heating's inherent limitations. The fireplace produces radiant heat, which means that surfaces facing the fire receive warmth while surfaces facing away remain cold. Sitting close to the fire, you might feel toasty on your front side while your back remains chilled. The solution, developed through countless winters of experience, was rotation. Your family learned to sit in a roughly circular arrangement around the fire, periodically shifting positions so everyone got equal access to the warmth. When one side of your body grew too hot and the other too cold, you swapped places with someone else, or simply turned yourself around. The children made a game of it, calling out, "Rotate!" and shuffling positions with giggles, turning necessity into entertainment. Nighttime brought its own challenges. The fire needed to be banked, covered with ash to slow its burn. But even a well-banked fire might die by 3 or 4 in the morning, leaving the cabin to gradually cool until someone rose to rebuild it. That someone was usually you, waking in the cold darkness to perform the essential ritual of fire starting that meant the difference between a merely cold morning and a dangerously cold one. You've become expert at fire starting, as any frontier survivor must. Your technique begins the night before, when you prepare kindling and tinder and position them within easy reach. A small box near the hearth holds your fire-starting essentials: char cloth, cotton fabric previously burned to carbonization, which catches sparks easily, flint and steel for creating those sparks, and a supply of fine shavings that will catch from the char cloth and build into flame. The process takes perhaps 5 minutes on a good morning, longer if the char cloth has absorbed moisture or the kindling is stubborn. But those 5 minutes feel endless when you're standing in a 20-degree cabin with shaking hands, breath visible, toes already aching in their wool socks. You've seen families who assign this duty in rotation, one person's job each night of the week. But in your household, you've simply accepted it as part of your role. The fire is your responsibility and you take it seriously. Historians note that fire management was treated as almost a sacred duty in frontier families, with good reason. A fire that went completely cold on a severe night could spell disaster. Even if the family survived until morning, restarting from nothing took far longer than maintaining existing coals, and the cabin's interior temperature could drop low enough to damage stored foods, freeze the water supply, and create conditions that the very young or very old might not survive. So you wake in the cold dark every night to check the coals. Sometimes you only need to add a log and adjust the damper. Sometimes the fire has died more than expected, and you need to coax it back to life with careful breath and patient addition of fuel. But you never ignore it, never trust that everything will be fine until morning. The fire demands attention, and you provide it willingly, knowing that your family's warmth, their survival, depends on your vigilance. This is what staying warm meant in 1840s America. Constant effort, careful preparation, and adaptations woven so thoroughly into daily life that they became invisible to those who practiced them. It was hard, it was exhausting, and it worked more often than not, keeping families alive through winters that would defeat unprepared modern visitors within days. Outside, the wind howls against your carefully chinked walls. Inside, the fire crackles, and your family breathes softly in their layered beds. The cold is real, immediate, pressing against every surface. But for now, for tonight, you're warm enough. That's all frontier life ever promised. Warm enough, fed enough, alive enough to face another day. The bucket is frozen solid this morning, a thick layer of ice sealing the water you carried in last night, and you stand looking at it with the particular frustration of someone who has this exact experience 3 or 4 times every week during winter months. Water, the most basic necessity of life, becomes an endless source of labour and aggravation when temperatures drop below freezing. You set the bucket near the fire to thaw, knowing it will take an hour before you can access any liquid, then bundle up for the trek to the creek. This is the morning ritual that winter imposes, carrying water that freezes, thawing water to use, watching it freeze again overnight, repeating endlessly until spring. There is no running water to turn on, no tap to open, no plumbing that brings this essential resource directly to your cabin. There is only you, a bucket, and the quarter-mile walk to the nearest reliable water source. The creek is still flowing, barely. You can see it moving beneath a thin layer of ice, the current preventing complete freezing even when air temperatures drop well below zero. But accessing that flowing water requires effort. You need to break through the ice, often several inches thick by deep winter, to reach the liquid below. You've learned to keep a heavy rock positioned at your watering spot specifically for this purpose, and you've worn a path through the snow that you refresh after every snowfall. Breaking through ice is tedious rather than difficult, a matter of persistence rather than strength. You lift your rock and drop it repeatedly on the same spot until cracks form, then use a branch to clear the ice chunks and create an opening large enough for your bucket. The water that fills your bucket is shockingly cold, cold enough to ache your hands even through the brief exposure of dipping and lifting. And then you walk back, bucket heavy in your grip, watching the surface begin to freeze before you even reach the cabin door. Here's the math that makes this exhausting. Your family uses roughly 5 to 10 gallons of water per day, a fraction of what modern households consume, but still a significant amount that must be carried by hand from a distant source. That's 2 to 4 trips minimum, more if you're washing clothes or bathing, or have animals that also need watering. In summer, this is merely tedious. In winter, it becomes one of the most time-consuming and uncomfortable chores you face. The stock animals add their own water demands. Your cow needs perhaps 10 gallons daily, more if she's producing milk. The horse needs 8 to 10 gallons. The chickens collectively need a gallon or 2. These animals can't fetch their own water any more than your children can, so their needs become your responsibility, added onto the human needs that already consume so much of your time. Some families attempted to solve this problem through well digging, sinking a shaft into the earth until they struck groundwater that could be raised by bucket without the trek to a distant source. But wells freeze too, sometimes worse than creeks. There's still water in a well lacking the anti-freezing effect of flowing current. And wells are dangerous, both to dig and to use. Men have died in well collapses, children have fallen into unguarded openings, and the labour of digging through rocky New England soil often proved prohibitive. Your family relies on the creek and accepts the labour that comes with it. The afternoon brings another water-related chore, melting snow. When fresh snow falls, clean, white, uncontaminated by contact with ground or animals, it becomes a water source that can supplement your creek trips. You pack buckets with snow and set them near the fire, watching the slow transformation from solid to liquid, though the exchange rate is discouraging. A bucket of snow produces only about 1/3 of a bucket of water, meaning you need 3 times the volume of snow to equal 1 trip to the creek. Still, snow melting has its advantages. It's closer, requiring only a trip to the dooryard rather than the quarter-mile trek. It can be done gradually throughout the day, buckets rotating near the fire as your other activities allow. And the water produced is often cleaner than creek water, lacking the sediment and debris that flowing water carries. Elizabeth has developed an elaborate system for managing the household water supply, and watching her orchestrate this choreography reveals the hidden complexity of frontier domestic life. She keeps track of which water is suitable for which purpose, creek water for cooking and drinking, unless particularly muddy, in which case it settles overnight before use. Snowmelt water for delicate cooking tasks where sediment might matter, used wash water saved for the animals who don't care about soap residue, chamber pot contents carried well away from the water source to prevent contamination. The chamber pots, since we're discussing them, represent another facet of winter water management that polite conversation typically omits. Nobody wants to trek to the outhouse at 3 in the morning when it's 20 below zero, so chamber pots provided indoor facilities for nighttime use. These vessels required daily emptying and washing, tasks that fell to the women and children of the household, and managing their sanitation in a cramped cabin without running water required constant attention. Here's something you probably don't want to think about. When chamber pot water froze before it could be emptied, you had to thaw it before you could dispose of it. This was winter reality, unglamorous, uncomfortable, and simply accepted as part of life's necessities. Bathing presents another water-related challenge that frontier families approached very differently than modern sensibilities expect. Full-body bathing in winter was rare, often limited to once per month or even less, because the labour of heating enough water combined with the danger of exposing wet skin to cold air made frequent bathing impractical and potentially hazardous. Instead, families practiced spot cleaning, washing hands and face regularly, occasionally sponging down with warm water in front of the fire, and relied on the miracle of wool's odour resistance to maintain social acceptability. Historians still argue about how offensive frontier families actually smelled. Some evidence suggests that people who all live in similar conditions, with similar bathing habits, simply don't notice each other's body odours the way an outside observer might. Other evidence from diaries and letters written by visitors to frontier communities suggests that the smell could be quite powerful, particularly in the close quarters of a winter cabin where ventilation was necessarily limited. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Winter bodies weren't fresh showered, certainly, but neither were they revoltingly filthy. Families maintained the level of hygiene that their circumstances allowed, which was less than modern standards but more than complete neglect. And the standards of the time were different. Nobody expected people to smell like soap year-round, and body odour was simply a fact of human existence rather than a social failing. The one exception was laundry. Clean clothes mattered in ways that clean bodies didn't, partly for social reasons and partly for practical ones. Dirty clothes lose their insulating properties as oils and grime clog the fibres, making them less effective at the warmth retention that survival depended upon. Washing clothes in winter meant heating massive quantities of water, maintaining the heat throughout the washing process, and then somehow drying the wet fabric in an environment where anything hung outside would freeze solid within minutes. Elizabeth handled this challenge by limiting winter laundry to essentials, undergarments, badly soiled outer clothes, and doing her washing on mild days when she could hang items near the fire without creating a steam room inside the cabin. The water chores never end in winter. You'll make 3 more trips to the creek before day's end, filling buckets that will freeze overnight, maintaining the supply that keeps your family functioning. It's exhausting, repetitive, and absolutely essential. One of those hidden labours that makes frontier survival so much harder than modern imagination typically grasps. But there's also something almost meditative about it, these daily water pilgrimages. The walk to the creek takes you through quiet woods, where snow muffles sound and the world feels impossibly peaceful. You see animal tracks, deer, rabbit, the occasional fox, and read them like a naturalist, piecing together the stories they tell about your wild neighbours. The cold is sharp but clarifying, and the labour is honest in a way that desk work never quite achieves. You return to the cabin with your bucket, set it by the fire to prevent freezing, and prepare for the next trip. Water in a frozen world is life itself, and you carry it home 1 bucket at a time. The smell of simmering beans fills the cabin, mixing with wood smoke and the ever-present mustiness of wool worn too long without washing. Elizabeth stands at the hearth, tending a cast-iron pot that hangs from the iron crane, that pivoting arm that allows her to swing pots over the fire for cooking, or away from it for serving, without risking burns from reaching directly into the flames. Cooking in winter is both simpler and more dangerous than modern food preparation. Simpler because the ingredients are limited. You work with what's stored, what's preserved, what's available, period. More dangerous because every meal involves fire, hanging pots, splattering grease, and the ever-present risk of fabric catching flame. Elizabeth's skirts have been singed more times than either of you can count, and her forearms carry small burn scars that map her years of fireside cooking. Tonight's dinner is a variation on a theme you've eaten dozens of times this winter, and will eat dozens more times before spring. Beans with salt pork, seasoned with whatever onion and herbs Elizabeth can coax from the diminishing stores. The beans have been soaking since yesterday. Dried beans require this patient preparation, the slow rehydration that transforms inedible seeds into something approaching tender. And now they're cooking even more slowly, the low heat required to properly soften them requiring hours of simmering. This is the pace of frontier cooking, slow, patient, measured in hours rather than minutes. The pot of beans began its cooking this morning and will continue through the afternoon, ready by evening after nearly 8 hours over the fire. Fast cooking happens only over high flames, frying meat, boiling water, while anything more substantial requires the gentle heat that extracts nutrition from tough ingredients without burning them. The cast iron equipment that makes this possible represents one of your family's most valuable possessions. Your collection includes the large bean pot currently in use, a smaller pot for stews and soups, 2 skillets of different sizes, a covered Dutch oven that can be used for baking when buried in coals, and a flat griddle for cornbread and pancakes. Each piece was expensive when purchased, but the investment has proven worthwhile. Properly maintained cast iron lasts essentially forever, passing from generation to generation with only occasional reseasoning required. The reflector oven is another tool that extends your cooking capabilities. This semicircular metal device sits before the fire with its open side facing the flames, reflecting heat around whatever food is placed inside. Biscuits, small roasts, even pies when ingredients allow. It's simpler than the enclosed brick ovens some families build, but also more flexible, portable enough to reposition as the fire shifts and compact enough to store easily between uses. Here's a quirky detail about frontier baking that might surprise you. Temperature control was entirely by feel. Modern recipes specify precise temperatures, 350 degrees for cookies, 400 for bread. But frontier cooks had no thermometers and no way to standardize heat. Instead, they learned to gauge temperature by holding their hands near the oven or fire and counting the seconds until the heat became unbearable. 2 seconds meant very hot, suitable for quick baking. 5 seconds meant moderate, good for longer baking. 10 seconds meant low, appropriate for slow cooking. This hand-based technique was passed from mother to daughter, refined through years of practice until experienced cooks could judge temperature with remarkable accuracy. The cornmeal that forms the foundation of many winter meals comes from your own crop, dried on the cob and ground as needed in a small hand mill that represents another significant investment. Grinding corn is another slow-paced task. You can produce perhaps a quart of meal per hour of cranking, enough for a day's worth of cornbread, but the fresh ground result is noticeably better than commercial meal that might sit for months before use. The monotony of winter eating deserves mention because it shapes the psychological experience of the season as much as the cold does. You will eat beans in some form multiple times per week, every week, until spring. Cornbread appears at nearly every meal, varying only in shape and whether it's fresh or day-old. Salt pork flavours almost everything, its fatty richness both necessary for calories and eventually tiresome in its constancy. The occasional chicken, when you decide a hen has stopped laying and isn't worth feeding through to spring, provides variety that feels almost luxurious. Elizabeth fights this monotony through creativity that impresses you anew each winter. She varies the seasonings, sage in the beans one day, dried thyme another, a precious bit of molasses when something sweeter is needed. She changes the cornbread, baked in a skillet, baked in a spider, a skillet with legs that stand in the coals, fried as individual cakes, dressed with cracklings from rendered lard. She rotates through her preserved vegetables, potatoes one day, turnips the next, carrots after that, trying to prevent any single flavour from becoming too overwhelming. The children, of course, complain anyway. Thomas has announced several times that he's tired of beans and would rather eat nothing. He changes his mind by mealtime, hunger being a powerful persuader, but his complaints remind you of the psychological toll that dietary monotony can extract. Adults can rationalise, we eat this because it's what we have. Children simply experience their dissatisfaction directly, without the philosophical frameworks that make endurance meaningful. The danger of fire during cooking is real enough that Elizabeth never cooks without a bucket of water nearby. She's seen 2 cabin fires in her lifetime, one that merely damaged and one that killed. The Hendricks family 4 winters back who lost their home and Mrs. Hendricks to a grease fire that spread faster than anyone could control. The memory of that destruction keeps her vigilant, keeps her skirts gathered away from the flames, keeps her attention fixed on the pot and the fire even when exhaustion suggests she could rest. Historians note that fire-related injuries were among the most common causes of harm for frontier women, and that burns severe enough to be fatal were not unusual. The combination of floor-length skirts, open flames, and hours of mandatory proximity created conditions that would appall modern safety experts. Women learned to manage this risk rather than eliminate it. There was no alternative. But management wasn't always successful. The meal comes together as evening settles over the cabin. Elizabeth ladles beans into wooden bowls. Ceramic is expensive and breaks too easily for frontier use, and arranges slices of fresh cornbread alongside. The children gather around the table, their complaints forgotten in the face of actual food, and for a few minutes the cabin fills with the sounds of eating. Spoon-scraping bowls, cornbread being broken, the satisfied small noises of hungry people being fed. This is the fundamental purpose of all your preparation. These moments when your family sits together, warm and fed, surviving another winter day. The beans may be monotonous, the cornbread familiar to the point of tedium, but they're food. Real, sustaining food that will fuel the labour tomorrow requires and keep small bodies growing through the cold months. You clean your bowl with the last piece of cornbread, sopping up the bean juice and salt pork drippings that contain more calories than modern nutrition would recommend, but that frontier bodies need for warmth and work. The fire crackles, the wind whistles faintly at the door. Your family is fed. Tomorrow Elizabeth will start another pot of beans and the cycle will continue. But tonight, bellies full and the worst of the cold kept at bay, you allow yourself to feel something almost like contentment. The children are restless this morning, cooped up in the cabin while sleet rattles against the window and turns the world outside into a grey, hostile blur. Sarah tries to keep the younger ones occupied with a game involving corn kernels and an old tin cup, but their energy exceeds what any quiet game can contain. Thomas has already been scolded twice for roughhousing with his sister, and Emma's whining has reached a pitch that sets everyone's teeth on edge. This is the daily reality of frontier children during winter. Confinement in small spaces, limited entertainment, and boredom that modern children with their screens and organised activities can barely imagine. Your cabin is perhaps 16 feet by 20 feet, 320 square feet in modern terms, and it contains everything your family owns plus the family itself. Privacy doesn't exist. Personal space is a luxury nobody can afford, and the endless dark days of winter test patience in ways that the more active seasons never approach. Sarah's chores occupy her mornings at least. At 13, she's old enough for real work, carding wool, spinning thread, mending clothes, helping Elizabeth with cooking and cleaning. These tasks keep her hands busy and her mind somewhat engaged, though you've noticed a particular restlessness in her lately, the beginning of adolescence perhaps, or simply the accumulated weight of too many winters spent in this cramped space. The younger children have chores too, scaled to their capabilities. Thomas at 7 feeds the chickens, brings in kindling, and helps Sarah with whatever tasks she assigns. Emma, just 5, isn't capable of much real work yet, but she can sort buttons, wind yarn into balls, and perform small tasks that keep her occupied, while teaching her the skills she'll need later. Even the youngest family member is expected to contribute something, however minor. But chores occupy only part of the day, and children need more than work. They need play, education, socialization, all the elements of childhood that frontier winters made desperately difficult to provide. Schooling, when it happens at all, takes place in your cabin. Elizabeth serves as teacher during winter months, leading lessons at the table during the brief, bright hours between morning chores and early darkness. Reading comes first, always. The ability to read is the foundation of everything else, and you've seen what happens to families whose children grow up illiterate, unable to access the knowledge that books contain. Your family Bible serves as primary reading text, its familiar passages providing both literacy instruction and moral education simultaneously. Sarah can read fluently now, working through the challenging language of Scripture with only occasional difficulty. Thomas is learning his letters, tracing them with a finger dipped in water on the table surface, then copying them on the precious paper you've allocated for this purpose. Emma watches and imitates, absorbing the rhythm of letters and sounds even before she fully grasps their meaning. Beyond reading, Elizabeth teaches arithmetic, the practical math of commerce, farming, and household management. How many bushels of corn do we have? If we use 2 bushels per month, how many months will it last? These word problems emerge directly from survival needs, making abstract numbers concrete and consequential in ways that pure mathematical exercises never achieve. Writing instruction follows when paper and ink are available, which is not always. Paper is expensive, ink must be made from walnut husks or purchased from distant merchants, and every written page represents resources that have alternative uses. Sarah practices her penmanship on old newspapers, writing between the printed lines until every margin is filled. Thomas practices on a slate when he can find the chalk, erasing and rewriting until the slate turns grey with residue. Here's something that might surprise you. Literacy rates among frontier families varied enormously, and historians still argue about what percentage could read and write with functional competence. The optimistic estimates suggest that perhaps 70% of adults on the northern frontier had basic literacy by the 1840s. The pessimistic estimates put it close to 50%. The truth likely varied by region, religion, and family priorities. Some households prized education and sacrificed to provide it, while others viewed literacy as unnecessary for farming life. Your family falls firmly in the education valuing camp, partly because Elizabeth herself is unusually well educated for a frontier woman. She attended school through age 14, unusual for a girl, and her teacher encouraged her intellectual development in ways that shaped her lifelong priorities. She reads voraciously when books are available, shares that love of reading with her children, and insists that they will have opportunities she sometimes feels she missed. The afternoon brings a break in the weather. Not warmth exactly, but the sleet has stopped and a weak sun struggles through thinning clouds. You decide to risk outdoor time, bundling the children in their layers and sending them out to burn energy in the dooryard while you and Elizabeth watch from the cabin's relative warmth. They explode into activity, weeks of confinement released in a burst of running, shouting and snowball throwing. Thomas immediately begins constructing a snow fort, his engineering impulses finding expression in packed snow walls. Emma makes what she calls a snow angel, but looks more like a snow blob. Even Sarah, too old for childish games, can't resist joining a snowball fight that leaves all 3 children soaked and laughing. This is what they need, you realise. Physical release that the cramped cabin cannot provide. Modern child psychologists would recognise what you're observing. Children require movement, outdoor time, and unstructured play for healthy development. Frontier parents understood this intuitively, without the scientific frameworks, and did their best to provide outlets when weather allowed. The toys available to frontier children reflected both limited resources and considerable creativity. Sarah's cornhusk doll, made by Elizabeth years ago and still cherished, has a dress of scrap fabric and hair of real human hair saved from brushings. Thomas's toy soldiers are carved from wood scraps, painted with homemade pigments that are already fading. Emma plays with buttons, smooth stones and feathers, the small treasures that children have always found fascinating. Historians note that manufactured toys were available in 19th century America but rarely reached frontier households. The expense of transport, the limited cash available to farming families, and the feeling that money should go toward necessities rather than luxuries combined to make store-bought toys unusual. Children played with what their parents could make or what nature provided, developing imaginations unencumbered by commercial entertainment. The children return inside when the cold becomes too much, rosy-cheeked and finely tired in the good way that promises peaceful behaviour for the rest of the evening. Elizabeth peels off their wet outer layers, hangs them near the fire to dry and wraps them in blankets while hot cider, made from the last of the stored apples, warms them from within. This is the rhythm of childhood in winter. Confinement punctuated by brief releases, boredom relieved by scattered moments of joy, the slow accumulation of skills and knowledge that will serve them when they have their own households to manage. It's not an easy childhood by modern standards, but it produces competent, resilient adults who understand that life requires work and that pleasures must often wait. You watch your children settling into evening activities, Sarah with her mending, Thomas with a picture he's scratching into a piece of soft pine, Emma drowsing near the fire, and feel the particular tenderness that parenthood evokes. They didn't choose this life, this frontier, this winter. They simply arrived into it and are doing their best to cope with circumstances far beyond their control. Your job is to get them through to spring, to adulthood, to lives of their own. The winter makes that job harder, but not impossible. The cow is complaining this morning, her lowing carrying clearly through the cold air from the barn to the cabin where you're finishing your breakfast. She's been increasingly vocal lately, which probably means the cold is bothering her despite the barn's shelter, or possibly she's simply lonely. Cattle are social animals, and your single cow lacks the herd companions her instincts crave. Your livestock represent both investment and insurance, living resources that require constant care during winter, but that provide essential returns in milk, eggs, eventual meat, and labour. Managing animals through the cold months demands nearly as much attention as managing your human family, and the consequences of failure can be equally severe. The barn where your animal's shelter was built the summer before your cabin, a priority that might seem surprising until you understand how valuable these creatures are. A good dairy cow cost perhaps $25 in 1847 currency, roughly equivalent to a month's wages for a skilled labourer. Your horse, old as he is worth at least $50, and replacing him would strain your family's finances severely. Even the chickens, individually cheap, represent collectively a significant investment in future eggs and meat. These animals keep you alive, so you keep them alive in turn. The relationship is symbiotic in the most literal sense. The barn itself provides shelter from wind and precipitation, but little active heating. Animals generate their own warmth through digestion, and the barn is designed to capture and retain that metabolic heat while preventing excessive heat loss through walls and roof. You've stuffed the gaps between boards with straw, hung old blankets over the worst drafts, and even built a low wall inside the main space that helps retain body heat within a smaller area. Your cow, Bessie, though that's the children's name for her, not yours, produces significantly less milk during winter than during the lush grass months of summer. This is normal, a function of both reduced feed quality and the shorter days that affect bovine hormones in ways farmers have observed for centuries without understanding the mechanisms. You get perhaps a gallon per day now, down from 3 or 4 gallons during peak season. That gallon matters enormously. Fresh milk provides nutrition that's hard to replace from other sources, particularly for growing children. You drink some directly, save some for cooking, and when there's excess, Elizabeth makes butter or simple cheese that extends the milk's usefulness beyond its natural spoilage timeline. Feeding Bessie through winter requires careful rationing of the hay you harvested last summer. You estimate you have perhaps 4 tons stored in the barn's loft, enough you hope to see her through until grass returns in May. The calculation haunts you. Hay consumption depends on weather severity, animal condition, and factors you can't predict. A mild winter might leave you with surplus hay to sell or carry over. A harsh winter might leave Bessie underfed and your milk supply diminished. You supplement her hay with kitchen scraps, vegetable peelings, stale bread, the occasional handful of grain, and she's learned to anticipate these treats, her ears pricking forward whenever you enter the barn with the slop bucket. These supplements add variety to her diet and probably improve her nutrition, though you're guessing based on observation rather than any scientific understanding. The chickens present different challenges. They're hardier than you might expect, their feathers providing excellent insulation, but they need protection from predators and from the most severe cold. Their coop is a small structure within the barn, raised off the ground to prevent burrowing predators and equipped with a roost where the birds huddle together for shared warmth. Egg production drops dramatically in winter, down to perhaps 1 or 2 eggs per day from your flock of 8 hens, compared to 6 or 7 during summer's peak. The primary cause is reduced daylight. Chickens need around 14 hours of light to maintain peak production, and winter's short days fall far short. Some farmers solve this by bringing lanterns into the coop, extending the artificial daylight, and tricking the hen's biology into continued production. You've considered this, but worry about fire risk in a straw-bedded space. Here's a quirky historical detail. The practice of lighting chicken coops to extend production dates back at least to the Roman Empire, where farmers discovered that torches kept birds laying through winter months. The technique was rediscovered repeatedly throughout history, lost during periods of agricultural disruption, and passed down through farming traditions that often didn't understand why it worked, only that it did. The horse presents perhaps the most straightforward winter care. He needs hay, water, and shelter, and he provides labour that would otherwise require human muscle. You use him sparingly during winter, reserving his strength for essential tasks like hauling firewood or making the occasional necessary trip to town. He's old now, perhaps 18, and you watch for signs that he's struggling, refusing feed, lameness, the general decline that signals approaching end. So far he's holding steady, but you know his remaining winters are numbered. Animal illnesses in winter terrify you because your options for treatment are so limited. If Bessie develops milk fever, if the horse colics, if the chickens contract some mysterious disease that kills them one by one, your remedies amount to folk wisdom, guesswork, and prayer. Veterinary medicine exists in the cities, but here on the frontier you're the closest thing to an animal doctor your livestock will ever see. You've learned to watch for early warning signs, changes in eating patterns, unusual lethargy, alterations in manure that might indicate digestive problems. When symptoms appear, you consult neighbours who might have relevant experience, apply whatever treatments local wisdom suggests and hope for the best. Sometimes animals recover, sometimes they don't. The uncertainty is simply part of frontier life. The body heat your animals generate serves an unexpected secondary purpose, warming anyone who spends time in the barn. On the coldest days, you found yourself lingering near Bessie, absorbing her radiant warmth, grateful for the animal heat that supplements what your layers provide. The children know this trick too. Thomas especially enjoys spending time in the barn, ostensibly for chores, but really for the relative warmth and the animal companionship that's his closest approximation of the pets modern children take for granted. Historians note that the relationship between frontier families and their livestock occupied a complex emotional space. These animals weren't exactly pets. Their ultimate purpose was food or labour, and sentimentality couldn't be allowed to interfere with practical necessity. But neither were they mere objects. Daily care created bonds, and the eventual slaughter of an animal you'd fed and tended for years carried real emotional weight. Children especially struggled with this transition from living companion to dinner, and many adults recalled the first animal slaughter they witnessed as a formative, often traumatic experience. Your family navigates this complexity through a kind of deliberate, emotional distance. You care for Bessie responsibly, even affectionately, but you don't pretend she's anything other than what she is. A resource that provides milk now, and will eventually provide meat when her productive years end. The chickens are even easier to think about this way. There's something about bird intelligence, or the lack thereof, that makes emotional attachment feel less appropriate. The barn chores complete, you trudge back toward the cabin through snow that's accumulated overnight. Behind you, Bessie's complaints have subsided now that she's fed and milked. The chickens are pecking at the grain you scattered. The horse is munching hay with the patient indifference of an old animal who's seen many winters. Your livestock have been seen to. They'll survive another day, and so will you. The silence has become a presence of its own, a fourth wall that closes in around your family as January's isolation deepens. You haven't seen another human face besides your wife and children in 17 days now, not since that brief wave across the frozen meadow when Robert Spiller passed by on some errand of his own. Before that, it was the Christmas gathering at the church, which already feels like a memory from another life, another season, another you. This is cabin fever in its original literal form, the psychological deterioration that occurs when human beings, social creatures by nature, are confined too long with too few companions. You feel it as a kind of weight, a heaviness that makes even simple tasks seem harder than they should be. Elizabeth feels it as tears that come for no apparent reason, moods that swing from contentment to despair within the space of an hour. The children feel it as irritability, as squabbles over nothing, as a general atmosphere of frustration that permeates every interaction. Historians have documented this phenomenon extensively, noting that winter isolation on the frontier produced documented cases of genuine mental illness. Prairie madness, the settlers called it, in the Great Plains regions, where isolation was even more complete than in your relatively settled area. Diaries from the period describe symptoms that modern psychiatrists would recognize as depression, anxiety, and sometimes psychosis. Otherwise rational people hearing voices, seeing things that weren't there, becoming convinced that malevolent forces were closing in. The causes are multifaceted. Not just isolation, but the combination of isolation with cold, limited light, dietary deficiencies, and the particular stress of knowing that the outside world is inaccessible even in emergency. You can't just leave, can't just go somewhere, can't just escape the walls that simultaneously protect and imprison you. The prison bars are made of weather, and there's no guard to negotiate with. You cope, as everyone copes, through deliberate strategies that you've learned over successive winters. The first strategy is routine, maintaining a structured schedule, even when structure seems pointless, even when one day blurs indistinguishably into the next. Wake at the same time, eat at the same time, do chores in the same order, go to sleep at the same time. The routine provides artificial landmarks in a landscape that otherwise offers none. The second strategy is purpose, always having some project in progress, some goal that requires daily attention. Right now, you're carving a set of wooden spoons to replace ones that have worn out. A small task, objectively unimportant, but its incremental progress provides a sense of accomplishment that pure survival cannot match. Elizabeth is piecing a new quilt from fabric scraps accumulated over the past 2 years. Sarah is embroidering a sampler with the alphabet and a verse from Proverbs. These projects are not urgent, but they are essential. The third strategy is conversation. Deliberately talking to each other about something other than immediate concerns, sharing memories, telling stories, discussing ideas that have nothing to do with the firewood supply or the state of the food stores. You tell the children about your childhood in Vermont, about the grandfather they never met, about the journey west that brought your family to this land. Elizabeth tells them about her family's farm in New York, about the brother who went to sea and never returned, about the sister who married well and lives in a fine house in Albany. These stories are gifts you give each other, mental escapes from the cabin's confines into remembered and imagined worlds where the winter cannot follow. Here's something that might surprise you. The mental health techniques you're instinctively applying, routine, purpose, connection, are essentially the same strategies that modern psychologists recommend for combating isolation and depression. You didn't learn these from any textbook. You learned them from observing which behaviours helped you feel better and which made things worse. The human mind, given adequate motivation, can often discover what it needs for survival without explicit instruction. But the techniques don't always work, and you've seen what happens when they fail. 3 valleys over, the Peterson family had a daughter who stopped speaking one January, and didn't start again until April. The doctor in town said she'd had a nervous collapse and was prescribed rest and fresh air when weather permitted, and charged a fee the family could barely afford. The daughter recovered eventually, but she's never been quite the same. Quieter, more fragile, less willing to venture from home even in summer. And then there was old Mr. Jameson, who went out one February morning to check his traps and simply never came back. They found his body 3 days later, sitting against a tree not far from home, no sign of injury or animal attack. The general verdict was that he'd lost his mind to the winter, walked into the woods and simply sat down to die. His wife said he'd seemed normal that morning, but then, who can know what's happening inside another person's mind? These stories haunt you, partly because they could be your story if circumstances aligned wrongly. You test yourself privately, watching for warning signs. Am I thinking clearly? Am I feeling emotions appropriate to my circumstances? Am I maintaining connection with my family or withdrawing into myself? The self-monitoring feels slightly absurd. Surely if you were losing your mind, you wouldn't be aware enough to check for it, but it provides some comfort nonetheless. Elizabeth's coping seems solid, though you know she worries in ways she doesn't share with you. She's the emotional centre of the household, the one who notices when a child seems troubled and responds with comfort, the one who starts singing when the cabin's mood turns dark, the one who suggests games and stories and activities when boredom threatens to become something worse. Her strength comes at a cost you can see in her eyes sometimes, the particular exhaustion of someone carrying weight she can never set down. The children adapt as children do, their resilience both reassuring and slightly concerning. They've normalised this isolation, accepted it as simply how winter works, and that acceptance protects them from some of the psychological strain that adults experience. But it also shapes them in ways you wonder about. What will it mean for Thomas, growing into manhood with this annual experience of extreme confinement? What will it mean for Sarah, learning that women's winters are spent in endless indoor labour, while the world outside remains forbidden? You don't have answers to these questions, and perhaps there are none. You can only do what the winter allows and hope that spring will restore balance, as it always has before. The 17th day of isolation ends like all the others. Dinner around the table, stories by the fire, children put to bed, and then the particular quiet of evening when you and Elizabeth sit together, not always talking, sometimes just sharing space and presence in the candlelight. Tomorrow will bring day 18, identical in outline if not in detail, and then day 19, and then the slow accumulation of days until finally the isolation breaks and the world opens up again. You can endure this. You tell yourself so every day because telling yourself is part of what makes it true. The candle flame wavers as you light it, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls that shift and stretch like living things. This small point of light, a few inches of tallow surrounding a cotton wick, represents your primary defence against winter's 16 hours of daily darkness, and its cost in labour and resources far exceeds what modern electric abundance would suggest. Making candles occupied Elizabeth for the better part of 2 days last month, a process you observed with the particular appreciation of someone who understands how much work goes into things usually taken for granted. The raw material was tallow, rendered animal fat primarily from the hog butchering but supplemented with beef fat traded from a neighbour. Rendering transforms solid fat into liquid, removing impurities and water that would cause finished candles to sputter and smoke. The smell is memorable. Not pleasant exactly, but not as bad as you might expect either. Fatty, slightly sweet, distinctly animal in a way that's hard to describe. The dipping process requires patience that borders on the meditative. Elizabeth hung clusters of wicks from a stick, dipped them into the melted tallow, raised them to cool, dipped again, raised again, repeating this process perhaps 30 times per candle until each had accumulated enough coating to be useful. The dipping must be done at the right temperature. Too hot and the previous layer melts off, too cool and the tallow won't adhere properly, and maintaining that temperature over hours of work requires constant fire management. The result was perhaps 3 dozen candles of varying sizes, enough to light your evenings through January, and maybe into February if you're careful. If you're careful. Rationing candlelight is another calculation you've learned to make. How much darkness can you tolerate to extend your precious supply? How early can you go to bed to avoid burning candles at all? When is light essential, and when is it merely comfortable? Most evenings you light a single candle, one small flame to supplement the firelight, positioned where it provides maximum benefit for the household's evening activities. If someone needs to work on fine tasks, mending, reading, detailed handwork, the candle moves to serve them. Otherwise, it sits at the table's centre, throwing just enough light to navigate the cabin without stumbling. Here's a quirky detail that illustrates how darkness shaped frontier behaviour. People genuinely went to bed earlier in winter, often retiring by 7 or 8 o'clock, because staying awake in darkness was both uncomfortable and wasteful. This wasn't laziness, it was resource management. Every hour of candlelight represented tallow that could have been used for cooking, labour that could have been directed elsewhere, materials that frontier families couldn't afford to squander on mere convenience. The rich, of course, could afford better. Beeswax candles burned cleaner and brighter than tallow, with a pleasant honey scent instead of the vaguely animal smell of rendered fat. Whale oil lamps, for those who could afford the fuel, provided even better illumination. And in the cities, gas lighting was beginning to appear, though it would be decades before anything like it reached the frontier. Your family exists in the tallow economy, making do with what local resources provide. The darkness itself becomes familiar after a while, less threatening than it seems to modern eyes accustomed to perpetual light. You learn to navigate your cabin by feel and memory, knowing exactly how many steps from the door to the table, from the table to the fireplace, from the fireplace to the bedroom corner. The children develop the same spatial knowledge, moving confidently through darkness that would leave visitors helplessly disoriented. But familiarity doesn't eliminate all difficulties. Detailed work is essentially impossible by firelight alone. The warm glow is too dim and too diffuse for reading, sewing, or any task requiring visual precision. This means that educational activities must happen during daylight hours, that mending and handwork cluster around the evening candle, that long winter evenings offer limited options for productive occupation. Storytelling fills some of this darkness. Your family has developed a repertoire of tales that you cycle through the winter months. Bible stories, of course, but also folk tales from the old country, family histories passed down through generations, and increasingly the made-up stories that children request and adults improvise. The darkness seems less heavy when it's filled with words, when imagination provides the illumination that tallow cannot. Historians note that frontier darkness had profound psychological effects that extended beyond mere inconvenience. Human beings are inherently visual creatures, and extended periods of darkness affect mood, cognition, and even physical health in ways that weren't understood until the 20th century. Seasonal affective disorder, the depression that accompanies winter's reduced daylight, likely affected countless frontier families without anyone having a name for what they experienced. You felt it yourself, the heaviness that settles in as days shorten, the vague sadness that has no specific cause, the difficulty motivating yourself for tasks that seemed easy in summer. Elizabeth feels it too, though she rarely complains. The darkness gets inside you somehow, affecting your spirit in ways that diet and warmth cannot entirely counteract. The remedies available are limited but not non-existent. Sunlight, when it appears, should be seized. Stepping outside even briefly on a bright winter day provides something your body needs. Physical activity helps, the exercise of chores and work releasing something that improves mood and energy. Social connection, when possible, lifts spirits in ways that solitary coping cannot match. And candles help, even this small flame you're nursing through another evening. Light is life, on some fundamental level that transcends mere practicality. The candle is your small rebellion against the darkness, your assertion that human presence and activity continue even when the sun abandons you. The flame gutters, catches, steadies. You have perhaps 2 more hours of light before the candle reaches its end, and you'll need to decide whether to light another, probably not given your supply, or surrender to darkness and sleep. 2 hours to accomplish whatever evening tasks remain. Elizabeth's mending, Sarah's reading lesson, your own small projects. You settle into the candlelight's small circle, letting its warmth wash over you in ways that have nothing to do with temperature. Tomorrow will bring more darkness, more rationing, more of winter's relentless demands. But tonight, in this moment, you have light enough. The cough started 3 days ago, small and dry, and you told yourself it was nothing. Now Thomas lies on his bed with fever painting his cheeks red, his breathing laboured, and every rattle in his chest sends fresh fear through your body. This is what you dread most about winter. Not the cold, not the isolation, not even the hunger that threatens in late season, but illness, which strikes without warning and against which your defences are pitifully inadequate. Elizabeth is already preparing a poultice of mustard and flour, mixed with warm water into a paste that will be spread on cloth and applied to Thomas's chest. The heat and the mustard's irritation are supposed to draw out the sickness, to stimulate circulation in the lungs, to do something, anything, against the disease that's settled into your 7-year-old son. Whether it actually works is a question you've never been able to answer definitively. Sometimes children recover after mustard plasters, sometimes they don't. But doing something feels better than doing nothing. This is the frontier's approach to medicine. Inherited remedies of uncertain efficacy, applied with desperate hope by people who have no better options. The nearest doctor is 12 miles away, a day's journey in good weather, and you've heard he's not much better than guesswork anyway. Even if you could reach him, even if he could come, what could he offer that you can't provide yourself? He'd suggest bleeding, probably, or purging, treatments that seem as likely to harm as to help. Here's the historical reality that might disturb you. 19th century medicine killed people. Not always, not intentionally, but the standard treatments of the era, bloodletting, mercury-based medicines, aggressive purging, often weakened patients who might otherwise have survived. The heroic medicine practiced by trained physicians was sometimes more dangerous than the folk remedies used by families on their own, a fact that wouldn't become clear until the next century's scientific revolution. Your folk remedies, inherited from mothers and grandmothers and passed down through generations, are a mixed bag. Some work, or at least don't harm. Willow bark tea, which you give Thomas for fever, contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in modern aspirin, and genuinely reduces temperature and discomfort. Honey with lemon soothes coughs in ways that modern medicine still validates. Rest and fluids, the universal advice, help the body fight infection without adding new stress. Other remedies are useless but harmless, wearing garlic around the neck, which at least doesn't hurt anything. Sleeping with onions in the room, supposedly to draw out disease, which accomplishes nothing but provides a familiar ritual that soothes worried parents. Prayer, offered constantly, which provides psychological comfort regardless of its supernatural effects. And some remedies are actively dangerous, though you don't know this. The patent medicines sold in town often contain alcohol, opium, and various toxic compounds that mask symptoms while causing other problems. The tradition of keeping sick rooms sealed against fresh air, intended to protect patients from cold, actually concentrates infectious particles and reduces the oxygen supply that recovering bodies need. You're doing your best with the knowledge available, which is the most anyone can do in any era. Thomas's breathing worries you. That rattle, that wheeze, the effort each inhalation seems to require. Pneumonia is the word that hovers unspoken, the diagnosis that carries highest mortality risk. You've seen pneumonia kill before, the miller's youngest 2 winters ago who developed a cough on Monday and was buried by Saturday. The disease moved faster than anyone could respond, filling lungs with fluid until breathing became impossible. But Thomas isn't that bad yet, you keep telling yourself. He's still talking, still occasionally smiling at his sister's attempts to cheer him, still fighting in all the ways that matter. Children are resilient. Their bodies want to survive, and with proper care, with luck, with whatever grace governs these things, most of them do survive. Elizabeth applies the mustard poultice, adjusting Thomas's nightshirt and positioning the cloth precisely over his chest. He grimaces at the heat and the smell but doesn't complain. He's learned, in 7 years of frontier life, that complaining rarely changes anything. Sarah stands nearby with a basin of warm water, ready to refresh the poultice when it cools. Emma watches from the corner with wide, worried eyes that suggest she understands more than you'd like her to. The night stretches ahead. Hours of vigilance and worry that will blur together into exhausted morning. You'll take turns sitting with Thomas, keeping the fire high, refreshing the poultice, offering sips of water and willow bark tea. Sleep will come in brief snatches, interrupted by every cough, every shift, every change in his breathing that might signal improvement or decline. Historians estimate that childhood mortality in 19th century America ranged from 20 to 40%, depending on region and circumstances. 1 in 3 children, on average, never reached adulthood. The diseases that killed them, pneumonia, influenza, diphtheria, scarlet fever, typhoid, are largely preventable or treatable today. which makes those statistics feel alien and almost incomprehensible. But they were reality for families like yours, a reality that shaped everything from family size, have many children because some will die, to emotional attachment, love your children but guard your heart against loss. You've lost one already, a baby born between Sarah and Thomas who lived only 3 weeks before some unnamed illness carried her away. You don't talk about it often, but the memory surfaces now, in the night, as you watch your son fight for breath. The same helplessness, the same desperate application of remedies that might not work, the same prayers that might not be answered. But this is different, you tell yourself. Thomas is 7, not 3 weeks. He's strong, healthy, normally, well-fed and well cared for. His body has resources that an infant's doesn't. He'll fight this off, he'll recover. He has to. The mustard poultice seems to be helping, or at least you convince yourself it is. His breathing sounds slightly easier, the rattle slightly less pronounced. His fever remains high but stable, not climbing toward the dangerous peaks that signal crisis. Small improvements, or perhaps just the fluctuations of illness, but you seize on them as evidence of recovery beginning. Dawn will come eventually, bringing light that somehow makes everything seem less dire. You'll face another day of nursing, worrying, hoping, and doing everything limited knowledge and desperate love can provide. For now, you sit in the candlelight, watching your son's chest rise and fall, counting each breath as a victory. The healer arrived 3 days after Thomas's fever broke, travelling through the area on her circuit and stopping when she heard of illness in your household. She's an older woman, perhaps 60, with the weathered face and knowing eyes of someone who's seen every ailment the frontier produces and most of the deaths that follow. Her name is Martha, and her bag of remedies represents the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent treating people who had no one else to turn to. Martha isn't a doctor. Women weren't admitted to medical schools in your region, a fact that strikes nobody as particularly unusual, but she's treated more patients than most doctors ever will. She learned from her mother, who learned from her mother before that, a chain of knowledge stretching back through generations of women who served as their community's primary healers. The knowledge is a mix of genuine medicine and pure folklore, effective treatments and useless superstitions, wisdom and error intertwined so thoroughly that separating them is nearly impossible. She examines Thomas with practiced hands, listening to his breathing, feeling his pulse, examining his tongue and the colour of his eyes. Her pronouncement is guardedly optimistic. The worst has passed. His lungs are clearing. He should make a full recovery with continued rest and care. The relief that floods through you is almost dizzying. Then she turns to your other children, examining each in turn, pronouncing them healthy but recommending various preventive measures. More fresh air when weather permits, continued attention to diet, particular herbs she can supply that support children's constitution. You'll take her advice, pay her small fee, and feel grateful for the reassurance of someone who seems to know what she's talking about. Here's a historical reality that might surprise you. Folk healers like Martha often achieved better outcomes than formally trained physicians of the same era. Not because their remedies were necessarily more effective, but because they were less likely to employ the aggressive treatments, bleeding, purging, toxic mercury compounds that academic medicine favoured. Their gentler approaches, combined with the body's natural healing abilities, often produce better results than the heroic interventions that university-educated doctors applied with confident enthusiasm. The medical establishment, of course, viewed folk healers with contempt, dismissing them as ignorant women practicing dangerous quackery. This dismissal contained significant hypocrisy. The doctor's own treatments were often more dangerous than the grandmother's herbs, a fact that wouldn't become clear until controlled studies emerged in the following century. Historians still argue about how much medical progress was delayed by the profession's refusal to learn from traditional healers whose methods, while imperfectly understood, often worked. Martha shows Elizabeth her collection of herbs, explaining their uses and preparation methods. Black cohosh for women's complaints, elderberry for strengthening against winter sickness, feverfew for headaches, chamomile for sleep, yarrow for wounds that won't stop bleeding. The knowledge is detailed and specific, accumulated over decades of observation and experimentation, and Elizabeth absorbs it with the intensity of someone who knows she may need to apply it when no healer is available. The patent medicines that compete with traditional healers occupy a strange position in frontier medical care. These commercially produced remedies, available at any general store, promise cures for everything from consumption to constipation, from hysteria to hemorrhoids. Their labels feature impressive claims and sometimes cite famous physicians, creating an aura of scientific legitimacy that folk remedies can't match. What the labels don't reveal is what's actually in the bottles. Alcohol, primarily. Many patent medicines contained more than commercial whiskey, making them popular with people who wanted to drink without admitting they were drinking. Opium and its derivatives, which dulled pain and created pleasant feelings that patients interpreted as healing. Mercury, arsenic, and various toxic compounds that produce dramatic effects, but often more harm than benefit. You've used patent medicines yourself, during emergencies when nothing else was available, and they seemed to help at the time. The soothing syrup you gave Thomas during his worst coughing fits contained laudanum, you learned later, which is why it worked so well to quiet him. Whether it actually aided his recovery or merely masked symptoms, while his body fought the illness alone, is a question you can't answer. Martha has opinions about patent medicines, expressed with the particular tartness of someone who's seen their effects too many times. They sell you poison in a fancy bottle, she says, and charge you good money for the privilege of being harmed. Her hostility probably contains some professional jealousy. The patent medicine makers are competitors after all, but it also reflects genuine observation of patients who seem to worsen under commercial remedies. The practice of bleeding, which trained physicians still recommend, represents perhaps the most controversial treatment of the era. The theory holds that illness results from imbalanced bodily fluids, and that removing blood restores equilibrium. Doctors apply leeches or cut veins directly, draining sometimes significant quantities of blood from patients already weakened by disease. Historians are nearly unanimous: bleeding killed people. Patients who might have recovered with rest and nursing instead died from blood loss, their weakened systems unable to compensate for what physicians removed. The most famous example is George Washington, who probably died in part from the aggressive bleeding his physicians applied to treat a throat infection. Nearly half a gallon of blood removed over 12 hours from a body already struggling against illness. Martha doesn't practice bleeding, which is one reason her patients tend to do better. She also doesn't practice purging, the other pillar of heroic medicine, which involves inducing violent vomiting and diarrhea to expel supposed toxins, another intervention that weakens bodies that need strength. What she does practice is mostly watchful waiting, supporting the body's natural healing processes rather than attacking them. Rest, fluids, warmth, nutrition, and gentle herbal support for specific symptoms. It's not dramatic, it's not heroic, and it probably doesn't satisfy patients who want to feel that something active is being done. But it works more often than not, which is really all anyone can ask of medicine in any era. Thomas is recovering. That's what matters most right now. The crisis has passed, and whatever combination of care, remedies, and luck produced this outcome, you're grateful beyond words. He'll be weak for weeks, requiring extra rest and nutrition, but he'll grow strong again. Martha packs her bag, accepts your payment and thanks, and continues on her circuit to whatever household needs her next. In her wake, she leaves knowledge that Elizabeth will use and pass on, traditional wisdom that will help your family navigate the medical challenges that certainly lie ahead. Winter isn't over, and neither is the risk of illness. But today at least, your family is intact. The ground is frozen solid, hard as iron beneath the thin layer of snow that fell last night, and the reality of what this means settles over you with leaden weight. Old Mrs. Patterson died yesterday, peacefully in her sleep, her daughter reported, and now her family faces the grim logistics of winter death, a body that cannot be buried because the earth refuses to receive it. This is a truth about frontier winter that rarely appears in romantic stories. When people died between December and March, they could not be properly buried. The frost penetrated 3, 4, sometimes 5 feet into the ground, creating a barrier that no shovel could breach, no pick could shatter, no amount of determined labour could overcome. The dead had to wait for spring's thaw before returning to the earth. The Patterson family has placed Mrs. Patterson in their root cellar, the coolest spot available, where natural refrigeration will preserve her body until burial becomes possible. It's undignified, perhaps, and certainly distressing for family members who must access that same cellar for stored food throughout the remaining winter months. But there's no alternative that anyone has found. no solution to the simple physics of frozen ground. You've seen other arrangements over the years. Some families built small outbuildings specifically for this purpose, essentially improvised morgues where winter's dead could rest undisturbed until spring. Others wrapped bodies in canvas and stored them in barns, away from the main house and its daily activities. In towns, communal facilities sometimes existed, buildings maintained by churches or local governments, where the winter dead accumulated until the ground softened enough for mass burial ceremonies. The psychological toll of these arrangements was considerable, and historians note that grief during winter months carried additional burdens that other seasons didn't impose. You couldn't achieve the closure that burial provides, couldn't gather at a graveside for final prayers, couldn't complete the rituals that cultures develop to help the living release the dead. Instead, you lived with death's physical presence for weeks or months, reminded constantly that your loved one remained above ground, waiting. Mourning rituals adapted to these constraints in various ways. Memorial services were held shortly after death, even without burial, allowing communities to gather and grieve together. Graveside ceremonies were delayed until spring, sometimes months after the death itself, creating a strange doubling of grief, the fresh shock and the delayed ritual separated by winter's long gap. The Patterson family held their memorial yesterday, in the small church 3 miles from your homestead. The community gathered despite bitter cold, filling wooden pews with bundled forms that looked more like bundles of cloth than individual people. The minister spoke of Mrs. Patterson's life, her faith, her service to the community. Her daughter wept openly. Her grandchildren looked confused, too young to fully understand what death meant but old enough to sense the heaviness in the room. You remember Mrs. Patterson as a sturdy woman who always had extra cookies when children visited, whose garden produced the best tomatoes in the valley, whose advice Elizabeth sought when the children were sick or the preserving wasn't going well. She was 73, a remarkable age for this time and place, and her death wasn't tragic so much as inevitable, the natural end of a life fully lived. But inevitability doesn't eliminate grief, and the community's sadness is real, palpable, a weight that adds to winter's existing burdens. Here's a quirky historical detail. Some communities in extremely cold regions developed elaborate rituals around winter death that almost celebrated the delay in burial. Spring burials became occasions for multiple families to gather, sometimes burying several winter dead on the same day, transforming what might be dreary into something almost festive, a collective acknowledgement that life had continued despite winter's attempts to end it. Death during winter carried particular terrors beyond the burial logistics, the possibility of dying alone, isolated by snow from neighbours who might provide comfort or assistance, the possibility of children dying, leaving parents with months to grieve before the earth could receive small bodies, the possibility of the entire family dying, from illness, from cold, from accident, with no one knowing until spring revealed what winter had hidden. You've heard stories of families found dead in their cabins when neighbours finally managed to check on them after winter's grip loosened. Entire households, sometimes 4 or 5 people, dead from cold or illness, or some combination that no one survived to explain. The bodies preserved by winter's cold, discovered only when spring's warmth brought odours that alerted passers-by to tragedy. These stories haunt every frontier family, contributing to the particular anxiety that winter brings. You check on your nearest neighbours when you can, struggling through snow to exchange brief waves, confirm that smoke still rises from chimneys, verify that life continues in the isolated cabins scattered across the landscape. These checks are imperfect. You can't reach everyone, can't guarantee that your own family wouldn't be among the undiscovered dead, but they provide some reassurance, some connection, some sense that the community watches out for its own. Mrs. Patterson's death has reminded everyone of mortality's constant presence, has sharpened the awareness that each family member's survival through winter is not guaranteed. Elizabeth holds the children a little closer these days, checks on Thomas's recovery with heightened attention, seems to watch you with eyes that calculate risk and wonder what she would do if you were gone. You try to reassure her, but how can you promise what no one can guarantee? Winter takes who it takes, and all your preparation can only reduce the odds, not eliminate them. Somewhere out there, in a root cellar or barn or purpose-built shed, Mrs. Patterson waits for the ground to soften, and her waiting serves as a reminder that you might join her before the season ends. Morbid thoughts perhaps, but frontier life doesn't permit the illusion that death happens only to others. It's present, visible, discussed openly in ways that modern life often avoids. Children grow up understanding that people die, that their own survival isn't assured, that each spring represents victory over forces that actively sought their end. This understanding shapes them, makes them both more resilient and more aware of life's fragility. Sarah, at 13, has already attended multiple funerals, has seen bodies prepared for burial, has absorbed the reality that her own death might come sooner rather than later. She's not traumatized by this knowledge. It's simply context for a life lived always at the edge of danger. Spring will come, eventually. The ground will thaw. Mrs. Patterson will receive proper burial, and the community will gather again to complete the rituals that winter interrupted. Life will continue, as it always does, carrying forward despite the losses that accumulate year after year. Until then, you light a candle for Mrs. Patterson, say a prayer for her journey, and return to the business of keeping your own family alive through the darkness that remains. Elizabeth hasn't stopped moving since dawn, and watching her exhaustion accumulate throughout this January day fills you with helpless concern. She's preparing breakfast while simultaneously supervising Thomas's recovery, planning today's meals from diminishing supplies, mentally inventorying the mending that needs attention, considering when she can possibly fit in the spinning that's fallen behind, and managing the emotional needs of 3 children confined in a space smaller than most modern bedrooms. This is women's work on the frontier. Endless, invisible, essential labour that sustains everything else, but receives surprisingly little recognition in the historical record. Men's work, the chopping and building and visible physical labour, tends to dominate accounts of frontier life, but women's work made survival actually possible. Without Elizabeth and women like her, no cabin would function, no family would stay fed and clothed, no children would be raised to continue the cycle. The gender division of labour on the frontier reflected both tradition and practicality, though separating these factors is often impossible. Women's work centred on the domestic sphere: cooking, cleaning, child-rearing, textile production, food preservation, medical care, emotional management. Men's work centred on the external sphere: agriculture, hunting, building, trade, community governance. The boundaries weren't absolute. Women helped with harvesting, men sometimes cooked, but the general pattern held across most frontier communities. The workload was staggering. Historians who've attempted to quantify women's labour estimate that a frontier wife worked between 12 and 16 hours daily, with little variation between seasons and virtually no days of rest. The task changed with the calendar, preserving in fall, textile production in winter, gardening in spring and summer, but the labour never stopped. Elizabeth's day-to-day will include, at minimum, preparing 3 meals from ingredients that require extensive processing, maintaining the fire that keeps everyone alive, tending Thomas's ongoing recovery, supervising the younger children's activities and minor chores, teaching whatever lessons can be fit into the daylight hours, mending at least one garment that's developed a critical tear, starting on the spinning that she's promised herself she'll address, and providing whatever emotional support family members require, while managing her own psychological state in conditions that would challenge anyone's equilibrium. And this is a light day, relatively speaking. Wash days were worse: hauling water, heating it, scrubbing clothes on a washboard until hands cracked and bled, wringing heavy wet fabric, finding somehow to dry it in a cabin where every surface is already claimed. Baking days were worse too: mixing dough, maintaining oven temperature through feel, producing the bread that everyone consumes without thinking about the labour it represents. Here's something that might disturb you. Women age faster on the frontier than men did, a pattern documented in countless photographs and family records. The endless labour, the repeated pregnancies, the nutritional demands of nursing infants while working constantly, and the particular stresses of domestic responsibility combined to wear women down in ways that even the brutal physical labour of men's work didn't always match. A frontier woman of 40 often looked 60 by modern standards, her body exhausted by decades of effort that never paused. Elizabeth isn't 40 yet, she's 34, but you can see the toll already. The grey appearing in her hair, the lines around her eyes, the way she moves slightly more slowly than she did even 5 years ago. She doesn't complain because complaining wastes energy that could be productive. But you see her fatigue in unguarded moments when she thinks no one is watching. The emotional labour deserves special mention because it's perhaps the most invisible of all women's work. Elizabeth maintains the household's psychological equilibrium in ways that would tax a trained therapist. She mediates disputes between children, soothes anxieties, celebrates small victories, mourns losses alongside everyone else while somehow remaining strong enough to support others. She reads moods and adjusts her behaviour accordingly, sensing when someone needs comfort versus when they need space, when humour will help versus when it will offend. This work happens constantly, automatically, without acknowledgement or compensation. The family benefits enormously. Your own mental health through this winter has depended heavily on Elizabeth's presence and support, but the benefit is so woven into daily life that it becomes invisible, taken for granted like air or gravity. Historians note that women's emotional labour on the frontier often determined whether families thrived or merely survived. Communities with strong female networks, women supporting each other, sharing burdens, maintaining social connections, showed better outcomes across multiple measures. Lower mortality rates, less documented mental illness, stronger community cohesion. Women built these networks through deliberate effort, organising quilting bees and church activities and neighbourly visits that provided both practical help and emotional sustenance. Elizabeth maintains connections with the Miller women, the Johnson women, and others in the sparse community surrounding your homestead. These connections are her lifeline, providing adult conversation, shared wisdom, and mutual support that isolated cabin life otherwise denies. When visits are possible, the women gather and talk and work together in ways that sustain everyone's spirits through the long months of separation. The children depend on Elizabeth in ways they'll never fully appreciate until they're parents themselves. Sarah has begun absorbing the endless knowledge required for frontier housekeeping, learning from example and instruction skills she'll need when she has her own household. The younger ones simply assume that mother is always there, always capable, always ready to meet whatever need arises. This assumption is both a compliment and a burden, evidence of Elizabeth's competence and simultaneously a weight she carries constantly. You watch her now, stirring the pot over the fire while simultaneously answering Emma's question about why snow is cold and instructing Thomas to stay in bed despite his protests of recovery. Her movements are efficient, practiced, the visible evidence of years of experience, but you also see the tiredness beneath the efficiency, the effort it takes to maintain the appearance of effortless capability. What can you do to help? Men's work and women's work remain separate enough that your assistance often creates more problems than it solves. You can cook badly, but Elizabeth would then need to redo whatever you produce. You can supervise children imperfectly, but they turn to their mother for the specific comforts you can't provide. What you can do is take over tasks that cross the gender boundary, carrying water, feeding animals, maintaining the fire so she doesn't have to. You resolve to do more of this, though you know the resolution will fade as your own work piles up. The gender division persists because it reflects reality. There's too much work for any individual, and dividing it creates efficiencies that random sharing doesn't match. But within those constraints, you can try to ease Elizabeth's burden, to acknowledge, if not lighten, the invisible labour that keeps everyone alive. She catches your watching and smiles briefly before returning to her endless work. The smile is genuine. She loves you, loves the family, wouldn't choose different if choices were available. But it's also tired, the expression of someone carrying more than anyone should have to carry. Winter continues, and Elizabeth continues with it, day after day, holding everything together through sheer determined effort. The blizzard that struck 3 days ago has finally released its grip, and you're surveying the damage from the cabin's doorway. Snow has drifted against the north wall to heights exceeding 6 feet, burying part of the woodpile and creating a white barrier that will take hours of shoveling to breach. The path to the barn has disappeared entirely, and somewhere under that smooth white blanket your animals wait for the care they haven't received since the storm made passage impossible. Men's work in winter centred on the brutal outdoor labour that women's indoor responsibilities made possible but didn't require. While Elizabeth kept the household functioning inside, you faced the elements outside, performing tasks that range from unpleasant to actively dangerous. This division wasn't perfectly maintained. She helped with outdoor tasks when necessary, you helped inside when you could, but the general pattern held. Your immediate priority is reaching the barn. 3 days without milking means your cow is suffering. 3 days without water means all your animals are desperate. The snow lies too deep for normal walking, so you fashion snowshoes from branches and rawhide, a technique you learned from a trapper who worked this region years ago, and begin the laborious process of breaking trail across the buried meadow. Every step requires lifting your foot high to clear the snow surface, then pressing down to compact a platform for the next step. It's exhausting work, the kind that leaves you gasping after just a few yards, but there's no alternative. Your animals need you, and reaching them requires simply doing whatever the conditions demand. The barn itself has survived the storm, thank God. The roof's still solid, the wall's still standing, though snow has drifted through gaps you thought you'd sealed. Inside, the animals greet you with desperate sounds. The cow bellowing, the horse whickering, the chickens clucking frantically. They're alive, which is more than you dared hope during the storm's worst hours. Watering them requires breaking ice on the snow around the barn and melting it in buckets held near your body. There's no other heat source, and the water in the barn froze solid during the 3-day siege. The cow drinks and drinks nearly 2 gallons before she pauses, and you resolve to bring more water once you've dealt with immediate needs. The milking is painful. Your cow's udder is swollen from 3 days of unmilked accumulation, and she's clearly uncomfortable. You work slowly, gently, extracting the backed-up milk that would have caused serious infection if left much longer. The milk itself is probably compromised, too long retained, but you'll let Elizabeth judge whether any of it is usable. Here's something that might not occur to you. Frontier men frequently lost fingers and toes to winter work that couldn't wait for mild conditions. The frostbite risk was constant. The warning signs often missed until damage was done, and the results could range from numbness that eventually recovered to necrosis requiring amputation. You've seen men with missing digits, permanent reminders of blizzards or cold snaps that extracted physical toll for work that had to be accomplished regardless of conditions. Your own fingers are aching now, the cold biting through your work gloves, but you recognise the difference between painful cold and dangerous cold. You're still warm enough, still safe enough, though the margin would shrink quickly if you stayed out much longer. The path to the woodpile requires more shoveling than your current energy allows, so you improvise, climbing over the drift rather than through it, extracting wood from the drift's edge rather than reaching the main pile. It's inefficient, but efficiency is a luxury that blizzard recovery doesn't always permit. You get enough wood to keep the fire going, enough to warm the cabin through tonight, and you'll dig properly tomorrow when your muscles have recovered. The trapline presents another concern. You set traps before the blizzard, hoping for fur that could be traded for supplies, and those traps have been buried under snow for 3 days. Some will be lost entirely, their locations impossible to find until spring melt reveals them. Others might hold animals that died during the storm, their pelts potentially damaged by the time you can reach them. The economic loss is real, though minor compared to the human cost that more severe blizzards have exacted from other families. You've heard stories of men caught out during blizzards, trying to reach home or barn or wherever safety lay, who became disoriented in the whiteout conditions and wandered in circles until exhaustion claimed them. Bodies found mere yards from their destinations, frozen solid by cold they couldn't escape because they couldn't see which direction to go. The stories are warnings, reminders that winter kills the careless, and sometimes the careful too. During the blizzard itself you stayed inside, which was the only sensible choice. The animals had to survive on their own. Enough hay for 3 days, we hoped. Enough body heat to prevent freezing, while the family huddled together against the storm's assault. The wind found every crack, every gap in your chinking, every weakness in your construction, demonstrating that preparation can only do so much against nature's full fury. The children were frightened, especially during the storm's worst hours, when the cabin seemed to shake with each gust, and visibility through the window dropped to 0. You and Elizabeth maintained calm, or the appearance of calm, telling stories, playing games, treating the blizzard as adventure rather than threat. Whether the children were reassured or simply followed adult cues about appropriate emotional response is unclear, but they survived the psychological stress along with the physical danger. Historians note that men's emotional processing of winter stress often differed from women's. The cultural expectation was stoicism. Men weren't supposed to complain, weren't supposed to show fear, weren't supposed to acknowledge the psychological toll that constant danger and hard labour extracted. This expectation sometimes helped, providing a framework for coping that minimised rumination on fears that couldn't be addressed. It sometimes hurt, denying men access to the emotional support that women found in their networks. You don't talk much about how winter makes you feel, which is normal, which is expected, but the feelings exist regardless. The anxiety when storms approach, the fear when illness strikes, the loneliness when isolation stretches too long, the particular sadness when looking at a landscape that seems determined to kill you and everyone you love. The day's outdoor work completes as afternoon shadows lengthen. You've watered and fed the animals, extracted enough wood to continue, and surveyed damage that you'll address more fully tomorrow. Your body aches in that particular way that hard labour produces, deep muscle fatigue rather than sharp pain, and you're looking forward to the cabin's warmth and whatever dinner Elizabeth has prepared. The snow lies thick across everything, beautiful in the way that dangerous things sometimes are. Tomorrow will bring more shoveling, more trail breaking, more of the endless labour that winter demands, but today's work is done, and you've earned the evening's rest. The Millers arrived yesterday, having struggled through 3 miles of snow-choked trails to check on your family after the blizzard. Their appearance at your cabin door, red-faced from cold, stomping snow from their boots, carrying news and questions and the simple gift of human presence, felt like water to someone dying of thirst. The isolation had become so complete that another human voice, another face, another perspective on the world seemed almost miraculous. This is how frontier communities survived, through the deliberate maintenance of connections that isolation constantly threatened to sever. The neighbour check system that the Millers practiced wasn't formal or organised. There were no schedules, no obligations, no penalties for failure. But it existed nonetheless. A web of mutual concern that kept individual families from becoming completely lost. Robert Miller reported what he'd seen during his journey. The Thompson cabin, smoke still rising, clearly occupied and presumably fine. The Johnson farm, similarly showing signs of life, though no one emerged when he passed. The road to town, completely impassable, drifted with snow that would require days of community effort to clear. News travelled slowly during winter, carried by people willing to brave conditions that made travel dangerous, but it travelled nonetheless. The Millers brought more than news. They brought a jar of preserved peaches, luxury food that Elizabeth received with gratitude that seemed almost excessive for the gift's size. They brought a newspaper, weeks old but new to you, containing information about the wider world that your isolation had rendered inaccessible. They brought word that the church planned a gathering, weather permitting, sometime in the next 2 weeks, a target for anticipation, a break in the endless sameness of winter days. Here's something the Millers also brought, though you might not recognise it immediately: normalcy. By treating the blizzard as an ordinary occurrence, by gossiping about neighbours and complaining about weather and discussing spring plans, they reminded you that life continued beyond your cabin's walls, that the world hadn't ended just because you couldn't see it. This reminder was psychologically valuable in ways that are hard to quantify but easy to feel. The visit lasted only 2 hours. The Millers needed to return home before darkness made travel dangerous, but those 2 hours shifted something in your household's mood. The children were animated in ways they hadn't been for weeks, excited by new faces and new stories. Elizabeth smiled more easily, engaged by adult conversation that didn't repeat the same tired topics. Even you felt lighter, the isolation's weight lifted by contact that proved you weren't alone. Community gatherings, when they happened, served functions far beyond their ostensible purposes. The church services that resumed when weather permitted weren't just religious observances. They were opportunities for information exchange, social connection, and the collective reaffirmation that the community still existed. People travelled miles through difficult conditions to attend, not primarily for spiritual reasons, but because human contact had become desperately scarce. The gatherings followed predictable patterns. Adults exchanged news while children, released from individual cabin confinement, played together with manic energy. Women clustered in groups, sharing information about illness, childbirth, household management, and community gossip that men's conversations rarely included. Men discussed weather, crops, animals, and the practical challenges that occupied their working hours. The gender separation reflected both custom and genuine difference in conversational interests. These gatherings also served as emergency communication networks. If someone was sick, if someone needed help, if someone had died, news spread through the gathering and mobilised whatever response the community could provide. The Patterson family, dealing with their mother's death and eventual burial, received offers of assistance from multiple neighbours who heard about their situation at a church gathering and volunteered whatever help they could give. Historians describe frontier communities as practicing a form of mutual aid that capitalism would later erode. The relationships weren't transactional in any simple sense. You helped neighbours not because you expected immediate return, but because you understood that you might need help yourself someday, and because helping was simply what community members did. The obligations were moral rather than legal, enforced through reputation and social pressure rather than contracts. Your family participates in this system, has participated since arriving in the area. You've helped with barn raisings, harvests, butcherings and emergencies. You've received help with your own barn raising, your own difficult harvests, your own crises. The exchanges don't balance perfectly. Some families give more than they receive, others receive more than they give, but the imbalances don't matter as long as everyone participates in good faith. The church gathering that the Millers mentioned happens 12 days later, a Sunday that dawns clear and mild enough to make travel possible. Your family bundles into the wagon, layers upon layers of clothing against the cold, and makes the 3-mile journey to the small white building where the community gathers. The sight of other people, dozens of them filling the pews, their voices creating a buzz of human noise that your ears have almost forgotten, produces an emotional response you didn't expect. Elizabeth's eyes are bright with something that might be tears. The children are silent, overwhelmed by the crowd after weeks of seeing only each other. You feel something shifting in your chest, some tension releasing that you hadn't realised you were carrying. The service itself is almost irrelevant, though the minister's words about endurance and faith resonate with obvious applicability to winter's challenges. What matters is the presence of other humans, the proof that the world continues, the restoration of connection that isolation had threatened to sever permanently. After the service, you linger as long as possible, talking with neighbours, exchanging news, absorbing the precious gift of community before the return journey imposes itself. The conversations aren't profound, weather, health, spring plans, but their normalcy is their value. Life goes on, people survive. Winter is hard but temporary. The ride home feels different than the ride out. The isolation waiting at your cabin seems less oppressive now, more manageable. You've been reminded that you're not alone, that the community exists and will help if you need it, that spring will come and with it the fuller connection that winter interrupts. The gathering has given you something to carry through the weeks ahead, a reservoir of human contact that will slowly deplete, but that provides, for now, the strength to continue. The candle burns low on the table, casting its small circle of light across the faces gathered for this evening's entertainment. Sarah holds the family's worn copy of Pilgrim's Progress, reading aloud in the steady voice she's developed over years of practice, and the rest of you listen as Christian faces his trials on the road to the Celestial City. The story has been read so many times that everyone knows what comes next, but the familiarity is part of its comfort, a reliable narrative in a world full of uncertainty. Entertainment in the darkness of winter meant something different than modern minds might imagine. Without electricity, without recorded music, without screens of any kind, without even reliable illumination after sunset, frontier families developed forms of amusement that depended entirely on human creativity and physical presence. Reading aloud, storytelling, music, games, and conversation filled the long evening hours when work became impossible and sleep had not yet come. Books were precious, often limited in number, read and reread until their pages wore thin from handling. Your family owns perhaps a dozen volumes. The Bible, of course, which serves multiple purposes beyond entertainment. Pilgrim's Progress, which has become a family favourite, a mathematics primer that doubles as education and occasional amusement. Several volumes of poetry that Elizabeth particularly loves, and a few novels of varying quality acquired through trade or purchase over the years. The reading ritual has evolved its own rhythms. Sarah reads most often, her fluency making the experience pleasant for listeners, though everyone takes turns on occasion. The reader positions themselves near the candle while others arrange themselves in the firelight, knitting or mending or simply sitting. The story unfolds at a pace determined by the reader's skill, and discussions often pause the narrative when someone has a question or observation. Storytelling without books provided another form of entertainment, particularly for the children. You've developed a repertoire of tales, some from your own childhood, passed down from parents and grandparents, some invented on the spot in response to requests, some drawn from the newspapers and travellers' tales that occasionally reached your isolated homestead. The stories vary in quality and coherence, but the children don't seem to notice. They're hungry for narrative of any kind, for the mental escape that a well-told tale provides. Music fills some evenings, when the mood is right and someone has the energy. Elizabeth plays the small dulcimer that was her grandmother's, its sweet tones adding warmth to the cabin's atmosphere. You can manage a few tunes on the harmonica, though your skill is limited and the instrument's range restricts what's possible. Sarah has begun learning to sing, her voice developing the strength and pitch that adult singing requires. The younger children contribute enthusiasm if not accuracy. The songs are mostly traditional, hymns learned at church, folk songs brought from distant homelands, work songs that rhythm accompanies. Some songs are sad, ballads of lost loves and distant homes that seem particularly resonant during winter's isolation. Others are cheerful, meant to lift spirits and prompt movement that confined bodies need. The children have favourites they request repeatedly, and the repetition becomes its own form of comfort. Here's a quirky historical detail. Frontier families often made their own musical instruments when commercial ones were unavailable or unaffordable. Fiddles could be constructed from carved wood and animal gut strings. Drums could be fashioned from hollowed logs and stretched hide. Even the simplest instruments, spoons to clap together, bones to rattle, a comb covered with paper to buzz against, provided percussion for dancing and singing. Games occupied another portion of entertainment time, particularly for children whose energy exceeded what reading and listening could absorb. Checkers was popular, played on boards that might be commercially produced or homemade, with pieces that might be carved wooden discs or simply different coloured beans. Chess existed among families with the pieces and knowledge to play, though it was less common than simpler games. Card games provided adult entertainment that children sometimes joined. Your deck of cards has seen years of use, the edges worn and certain cards identifiable by their creases, but the games remain enjoyable regardless. Whist was popular in your community, a trick-taking game that 4 players could enjoy for hours. Simpler games occupied the children when adult games proved too complex. The games served purposes beyond mere amusement. They exercised mental faculties that winter's routines didn't otherwise engage. They taught strategy, probability, and the social skills of competition and cooperation. They created moments of genuine excitement and investment that broke the monotony of endless similar days. Conversation itself was entertainment, though modern ears might not recognise it as such. Without competing distractions, talking with family members became an activity in itself, rather than something that happened alongside other activities. You discussed the past, planned the future, debated questions that had no practical urgency, but stimulated thought and engagement. The discussions weren't always profound, but they filled time and strengthened bonds. The children developed their own entertainment through imagination and creativity. Thomas constructed elaborate scenarios with his carved wooden soldiers, staging battles and adventures that occupied him for hours. Emma played with her cornhusk doll, creating conversations and situations that reflected her understanding of adult life. Sarah, increasingly adult herself, found entertainment in the grown-up activities that would soon be her primary occupation. Historians note that frontier entertainment served psychological functions that went beyond simple amusement. The activities created shared experiences that bound families together, provided mental stimulation that prevented cognitive decline, and offered relief from the constant low-level stress of survival-focused existence. Families who maintained rich entertainment practices showed better outcomes across various measures of winter survival and spring recovery. The candle gutters as Sarah reaches a good stopping point in the narrative. She closes the book carefully, marking her place with a ribbon that's been doing this job for years. The children protest, wanting more story, but bedtime approaches and the candle won't last much longer anyway. You bank the fire, settling coals beneath ash for overnight burning. Elizabeth shepherds children toward beds, the nightly ritual of washing hands and faces, saying prayers, arranging blankets and bodies for optimal warmth. The cabin settles into its nighttime sounds, crackling fire, wind against walls, the small noises of a family preparing for sleep. Tomorrow will bring more darkness, more entertainment challenges, more of winter's endless demands. But tonight's stories and songs have left everyone in better spirits than the morning found them. That's the goal, really. Getting through each day a little better than mere survival requires, finding joy where joy can be found, waiting for spring together. February has arrived, and with it the particular anxiety that comes from watching stores diminish, while winter shows no sign of releasing its grip. The potato bin in the root cellar has dropped to levels that require careful attention. The smoked meat is more than half gone. The flour barrel shows more wood than grain when you lift its lid. These are the hunger months, the time when autumn's abundance must stretch to meet spring's eventual renewal, and the stretching has become painful. You've entered the period that frontier families sometimes call the starving time. Not actual starvation for most, but the grinding worry of rationing, the constant calculation of how much remains versus how long it must last, the small sacrifices that accumulate into real hunger even if they stop short of genuine famine. Elizabeth has adjusted portions slightly but noticeably. The cornbread loaves are smaller, the bean servings are more modest. The meat, which once appeared at every meal, now appears at one meal daily if that. The adjustments happen without announcement, without complaint, but everyone notices. The children's appetites haven't diminished with the portions, and their hunger, not desperate, not dangerous, but present, manifests in irritability and requests for snacks that cannot be provided. The calculations run constantly through your mind. Roughly 3 months until the earliest possible spring harvest, lettuce and radishes and other quick-growing crops that provide nutrition even if they don't provide calories. More like 4 months until substantial food becomes available. Perhaps 60 to 70 pounds of potatoes remaining, maybe 100 pounds of various other root vegetables. The meat supply will last if carefully managed. The grain situation is tightest. You may need to purchase flour before spring, which means finding money that doesn't exist in quantities adequate to the need. Here's the historical reality that makes these calculations so fraught. Actual starvation happened on the American frontier, more often than comfortable modern narratives acknowledge. Not frequently, not routinely, but often enough that every family knew someone who'd experienced genuine food shortage, genuine hunger that went beyond discomfort into danger. The stories circulated through communities, warnings about families who'd miscalculated, who'd suffered setbacks, who'd run out of food before winter ran out of cold. The causes varied. Sometimes it was simple failure of harvest, bad weather, crop disease, pest infestation that reduced yields below survival minimums. Sometimes it was accidents or illness that prevented adequate preparation. Sometimes it was poor judgment, inexperience, or the particular bad luck that could strike anyone. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. Families facing weeks or months without enough food to sustain them. Communities usually stepped in when starvation threatened, pooling resources to prevent the worst outcomes. But communities had limited surplus themselves, and helping one family meant reducing supplies available for others. The calculation wasn't abstract. Every pound of flour shared with a struggling neighbour was a pound that might be needed by the sharing family before winter ended. Generosity carried real costs, and the balance between community obligation and family preservation created difficult moral terrain. Your family isn't starving. The distinction matters, even as the line between rationing and hunger blurs. You're eating less than your bodies want, less than optimal for work and health, but enough to survive. The children are slightly thinner than they were in autumn, but not dangerously so. The adults have redirected calories from their own plates toward growing bodies that need nutrition most. These adjustments are uncomfortable but manageable, for now. The danger is that manageable can become unmanageable quickly. An unexpected emergency, illness requiring extra nutrition for recovery, damage to stored food from pests or rot, guests needing to be fed, could push your careful calculations into deficit. The margin between tight but adequate and genuinely insufficient is smaller than anyone would like. Wild food sources offer some relief during the hunger months, though they're less abundant than summer and fall provide. You've set snares for rabbits, which occasionally provide fresh meat that doesn't draw on preserved supplies. The children find it exciting. Checking snares becomes an adventure that breaks winter's monotony, even as the practical purpose remains serious. When the snares produce, everyone eats better. When they're empty, you try again tomorrow. Ice fishing for families near suitable bodies of water provided another hunger month resource. You're too far from lakes deep enough to support winter fishing, but you know families who relied on fish to stretch their food supplies through February and March. The fish weren't abundant. Cold water fishing yields less than summer seasons. But every fish caught was calories not drawn from diminishing stores. Historians note that the psychological burden of the hunger months often exceeded the physical burden. The constant worry, the endless calculation, the fear that careful management might not be enough. These mental stresses took their own toll even when physical starvation never arrived. Families survived the hunger months, most of them, but they emerged exhausted in ways that went beyond simple caloric deficit. Elizabeth manages the food supply with skill born of experience, but even her management can't create abundance from scarcity. She experiments with recipes that stretch ingredients further. More water in the bean soup, more cornmeal filler in the meat dishes, smaller portions dressed up with whatever seasonings remain. The children don't complain, exactly, but they look at their plates with a particular expression that breaks your heart. You find yourself fantasizing about food, rich meals, abundant servings, the particular pleasures of eating until satisfied rather than eating until merely less hungry. The fantasies feel slightly shameful, evidence of weakness, but they're involuntary. Your body knows it's not getting enough and reminds you constantly through hunger that ranges from low-level discomfort to sharp, demanding urgency. Spring will come, the hunger months will end. The calculations will eventually resolve in your favour, as they have every previous year. But March lies ahead, and possibly April, and the gap between here and there seems to stretch endlessly. Each day brings you closer to relief, but each day also consumes resources that won't be replenished until that relief arrives. The children are in bed, sleeping the deep sleep that even hunger can't entirely disrupt. Elizabeth is working on some mending, conserving candle by working in firelight. You sit with your own thoughts, watching the flames and thinking about potatoes, about spring, about survival. The hunger months continue as they always do, and you continue with them. The storm arrived 3 days ago, when everyone thought winter was loosening its grip, and it has punished that optimism with savage thoroughness. March should mean warming trends, melting snow, the first hints of spring approaching. Instead, March has delivered the worst blizzard of the season, late winter's final assault on families whose supplies and spirits are already depleted. This is the cruelest trick that frontier winters played. The late storms that arrived after people had begun to hope, that struck when resistance was lowest and reserves were most depleted. Early winter storms could be weathered more easily because supplies were fresh and bodies were rested. Late winter storms hit families already exhausted from months of rationing, isolation and cold, and the timing made them disproportionately deadly. Your family huddled through the storm's 3-day siege, watching supplies dwindle, listening to wind that seemed determined to breach your walls, wondering if this was the storm that would finally exceed your capacity to survive. The woodpile, so carefully accumulated last autumn, has dropped to levels that require strict rationing. 1 log at a time, let it burn completely before adding another, accept colder temperatures as the price of extending the supply. The food situation has become critical. Not dangerous yet, you keep telling yourself, but close enough that the distinction matters less than it should. The potato bin is nearly empty. The smoked meat is gone except for scraps that Elizabeth is incorporating into soup to extract their last value. The flour ran out a week ago, making cornmeal the only grain available, and even the cornmeal supply concerns you. The storm has added isolation to deprivation. There's no possibility of reaching neighbours, no way to obtain help or check on others who might be struggling. The world has shrunk to your cabin and the immediate area you can access, which after 3 days of continuous snow amounts to very little. The barn is reachable, barely, through a tunnel of packed snow you've maintained with constant shoveling. The rest of the world might as well not exist. Here's the historical reality that haunts you. People died in late winter storms, died of cold when firewood ran out and frozen bodies were found in frozen cabins, died of starvation when the hunger months stretched beyond what stored food could bridge, died of illness when depleted bodies couldn't fight infections that healthier systems might have defeated. The late storms were feared specifically because they struck at the moment of maximum vulnerability. You've heard the stories. The family 5 miles north who ran out of firewood during a March storm 2 years ago, father frozen trying to reach a woodlot, mother and children surviving by burning furniture and huddling together until neighbours finally broke through. The elderly couple who died in their cabin, probably within days of each other, found only when spring thaw prompted a neighbour to check on their silence. The children who starved, actually starved, when a late storm trapped a family that was already on the edge. These stories aren't meant to frighten but to prepare. They're warnings about complacency, reminders that survival isn't guaranteed until winter actually ends, cautionary tales about the final obstacles that must be overcome. You carry them with you through this storm, using them to maintain vigilance when exhaustion counsels surrender. The children sense the crisis, though you've tried to shield them from its full weight. They're quieter than usual, asking fewer questions, accepting reduced portions without the protests that characterized earlier rationing. Thomas, recovered from his winter illness but still not fully strong, seems to have aged years in the months since Christmas. Sarah helps more than she should have to, shouldering adult burdens while still bearing childhood's vulnerabilities. Even Emma, too young to fully understand, reflects the household's tension in her unusual stillness. Elizabeth maintains her calm, or the appearance of calm, but you've noticed the strain behind her competence. She's lost weight, more than the rationing alone explains, and the circles under her eyes have darkened into permanent features. She's carrying the family's emotional burden along with her physical responsibilities, and both loads have become nearly unbearable. Historians who study frontier mortality patterns note that the final weeks of winter often claimed more victims than the deepest cold of January. The combination of depleted resources, weakened bodies, and renewed weather stress created a mortality spike that peaked in late February and early March. Families who'd survived everything else sometimes failed at the finish line. Overcome by challenges they might have handled easily 3 months earlier, you won't let that happen. This determination runs through you like fire, keeping you moving when exhaustion suggests stopping, keeping you thinking when despair counsels surrender. Your family will survive this storm. You'll reach your neighbours when passage becomes possible. You'll find a way to obtain food if your stores run out completely. You'll do whatever survival requires, because the alternative is unthinkable. The storm shows signs of weakening on its 4th day. The wind diminishes, the snow slows, and through the cabin's small window you can see hints of brightness that suggest the sun still exists behind the clouds. The crisis isn't over. You're still trapped, still low on supplies, still facing weeks of winter before spring truly arrives. But the immediate danger is receding. You'll check on the animals once travel becomes possible. You'll assess the woodpile situation and determine how much remains versus how much is needed. You'll take stock of the food supply and make decisions about rationing that will carry you through whatever remains of the season. These tasks feel almost normal, almost routine, after 3 days of nothing but survival. The children venture outside briefly once the storm clears enough to permit movement. Their joy at escaping the cabin, even into snow-choked freezing conditions, reminds you why survival matters beyond mere biological continuation. They deserve spring. They deserve the lives that lie ahead of them, the futures that winter cannot be allowed to steal. You watch them play, briefly, before the cold drives everyone back inside. March's storm has nearly broken your family, but nearly isn't completely. You're still here. You're still fighting. And spring, however delayed, is still coming. The icicle dripped. You noticed it during morning chores, water running down the cabin's south-facing wall, where sunlight struck the accumulated ice. Such a small thing, a single drip of water, but it carried weight far beyond its physical significance. Water dripping meant ice melting. Ice melting meant temperatures rising. Temperatures rising meant spring. Not here yet, but approaching, finally, after months that seemed endless. The signs have been accumulating for days now, each one adding evidence that winter's grip is loosening. You heard a robin 3 mornings ago, probably a scout, the first of the returning migrants checking whether conditions had improved enough for the main flocks to follow. Yesterday you noticed buds on the maple tree, tiny swellings that promised leaves to come. And now this dripping water, the first visible evidence that the frozen world is beginning to thaw. Relief mingles with exhaustion, in a combination that leaves you slightly dizzy. You've made it. Or rather, you're making it. The process isn't complete. Dangers still exist. But the end is visible now in ways it wasn't even a week ago. The worst is behind you, probably. And ahead lies renewal that your depleted body and spirit desperately need. Elizabeth noticed the dripping too, and something in her face changed. A softening, a release of tension she'd been carrying for months. She didn't cry, exactly, but her eyes were bright in a way that suggested tears were possible. The two of you stood together at the window, watching water drip from melting ice, and no words were necessary. You'd survived. Your family had survived. Spring was coming. The accounting of winter begins almost immediately. the inventory of losses and damages that must be assessed before rebuilding can start. Materially, you've lost less than you feared. Some stored food to rot or pests, some firewood to moisture, some equipment to hard use in harsh conditions. The losses are manageable, recoverable through spring and summer labour. Personally, the accounting is more complex. Thomas's illness left him weaker than he was, though he's recovering steadily. Elizabeth's exhaustion has accumulated to levels that will require months to restore. Your own body carries new aches, new limitations that weren't there last autumn. The children have grown, physically larger, emotionally more mature, in ways that represent both gain and loss. They're older now, in years that the calendar measures and in experience that frontier winters provide. Here's the bittersweet reality of spring's arrival. The joy of survival is always shadowed by awareness of those who didn't survive. Mrs. Patterson, who died in January and waited in her daughter's root cellar until the ground thawed enough for burial. The Thompson baby, born during the worst of the cold and too frail to survive more than a week. The old trapper who lived alone in the hills and whose cabin was found empty. No body discovered. His fate uncertain, but unlikely to be good. The community will gather soon, for funerals delayed by frozen ground and for reunions that isolation prevented. The gatherings will be celebrations and mournings combined. Joy at reunion mixed with grief at loss. Names will be spoken of those no longer present. Stories will be told. The community will account for what winter took and what it left behind. Your family will participate in these gatherings, grateful to be counted among the survivors. You'll attend Mrs. Patterson's burial, finally possible now that the ground has softened. You'll welcome the community's renewed connection after months of isolation. You'll begin the process of spring preparation, garden planning, seed selection, equipment repair that will occupy the coming weeks. The transition from winter to spring brings its own challenges, though they feel manageable after what you've endured. Mud replaces snow, making travel messy if not impossible. The root cellar requires attention, checking stores for spoilage that warmer temperatures might accelerate. Early planting decisions must be made, balancing the desire to get crops growing against the risk of late frosts that could destroy tender seedlings. But these challenges feel different than winter's challenges. They're productive challenges, oriented toward growth and future abundance rather than mere survival. The labour ahead will be hard, spring work always is, but it will have visible results, crops emerging from soil, animals multiplying, the world reawakening after its long dormancy. Thomas has recovered enough to help with light chores, his energy returning with the warming days. Sarah has taken on additional responsibilities, claiming tasks that used to be Elizabeth's as her contribution to the family's recovery. Emma runs through the muddy dooryard, delighting in freedom that winter denied, her childish joy a balm for adult exhaustion. Historians note that spring's psychological relief could be as significant as its physical benefits. The weight of winter, isolation, cold, darkness, constant survival anxiety, lifted not gradually but suddenly once the signs of spring appeared. People who'd been barely functioning found reserves of energy they didn't know they had. Families that had retreated into depression and conflict emerged ready to reconnect with communities and each other. You feel this lightening, this lifting, this sense that breathing has become easier, even though the air is no different than it was last week. The world seems brighter, more welcoming, more full of possibility. Spring does something to human spirits that survival through winter cannot quite explain. A biological response, perhaps, to increasing daylight and warming temperatures, or something more mysterious that resists analysis. Elizabeth suggested a celebration, something small but meaningful to mark winter's end. Fresh bread, flour obtained from town now that travel is possible, served with the last of the honey that you'd been saving. A family meal eaten slowly with appreciation rather than anxiety, acknowledging together that you've passed through the darkness and emerged into light. The celebration happens that evening, simple but profound. The bread is warm from baking, rich with honey sweetness. The children eat with abandon, their hunger finally allowed to be satisfied rather than managed. You and Elizabeth catch each other's eyes across the table, sharing a look that contains everything words can't express. Exhaustion, relief, love, gratitude, and the particular bond of having survived together. Spring has come, you've made it. The cycle continues. The evening settles soft around the cabin now, and you find yourself on the porch watching the sun lower, toward a horizon that seems somehow gentler than it did through all those frozen months. The air carries a warmth you'd forgotten existed, and somewhere in the distance birdsong rises and falls in the rhythms that your ears have missed without quite knowing what they were missing. The world is waking up, and you're waking with it. What did those winters teach really, when you think back over all the months of cold and darkness and survival? They taught that human beings are more resilient than they often imagine, that families can endure together what individuals might not survive alone, that community matters in ways that comfortable times can obscure. They taught practical skills, fire management, food preservation, animal husbandry, but also something harder to name about patience, about presence, about finding meaning in simple continuation. The pioneers who faced these winters didn't think of themselves as particularly heroic. They were simply doing what circumstances required, meeting challenges with whatever resources they could muster. The heroism, if there was any, lay in the daily repetition. Getting up each morning despite exhaustion, maintaining hope despite evidence that hope was dangerous, caring for each other despite the isolation that made caring harder. Ordinary people doing ordinary things under extraordinary conditions, and somehow surviving. You think about the children sleeping inside, growing older with each passing season, carrying forward knowledge and resilience that your grandparents passed to you and that you're passing to them. The chain stretches backward through generations who faced winters you can barely imagine, and forward toward futures you won't live to see. What you endured this winter, what every frontier family endured every winter, becomes part of something larger, a shared human story of persistence against difficulty. The last light fades from the sky in colours that feel almost impossibly beautiful after months of grey and white. Pink and orange and purple blend at the horizon, and the first stars appear in the deepening blue above. The world is vast and ancient and largely indifferent to human concerns, but it's also generous in its beauty, offering these small gifts of light and warmth to anyone patient enough to wait for them. Elizabeth joins you on the porch, settling beside you with the particular sigh of someone finally releasing months of tension. Neither of you speaks. The silence between you is comfortable, the silence of people who don't need words to communicate. You've been through something together, and the shared experience has deepened bonds that were already strong. Marriage on the frontier meant partnership in survival, and you've proven that partnership once again. The work of spring will begin in earnest tomorrow, but tonight is for rest, for reflection, for the quiet appreciation of having arrived at another beginning. The cycles continue. Winter will return as it always does. But for now, the return feels distant, theoretical, a problem for future selves to address. Present selves have earned this moment of peace. Your thoughts drift towards sleep as the darkness deepens, and you let them drift, releasing the vigilance that survival required. Tomorrow will bring its own demands, but tonight you're safe, your family is intact, and the world is warming around you. The fire crackles softly inside, unnecessary now for survival, but pleasant for comfort. The children breathe steadily in their beds, dreaming whatever dreams healthy children dream when danger has passed. The stars wheel slowly overhead, the same stars that watched over countless generations of humans facing countless winters. They'll watch over generations yet to come, including some who will never know winter's severity because the world will have changed so completely. But tonight, they watch over you, a single family on a single homestead, having done what humans have always done, endured. Your eyes grow heavy, and you let them close. The spring peepers have begun their chorus down by the creek. Tiny frogs singing their ancient songs of warmth returned. The sound is impossibly peaceful, a lullaby written by nature for anyone willing to listen. The winter is over, the spring has come, and tomorrow is another day. The darkness wraps around you like a blanket, soft and welcoming now instead of threatening. Your breathing slows, your muscles relax. The cares of survival drift away on the evening breeze, carried off to wherever worries go when they're no longer needed. Rest now, you've earned it. The hard work of spring can wait until morning. For tonight, just rest, and let the peace of survival settle into your bones. The world will still be there when you wake, warmer and brighter and full of possibilities that frozen months couldn't quite extinguish. Sleep comes easily finally after so many nights of vigilant wakefulness, and in your dreams, perhaps, their sunshine and green fields and the laughter of children running free. No longer confined, no longer hungry, no longer waiting for winter to end. It ended, you made it. Sweet dreams. And so, as the final embers of this long winter tale fade gently into the quiet, let yourself settle deeper into wherever you're resting right now. Feel the weight of your blankets, the softness beneath you, the safety that surrounds you, comforts your ancestors would have marvelled at, luxuries they couldn't imagine during those endless frozen nights. The world outside your window may be cold or warm, dark or bright, but you're here, sheltered, your survival tonight requiring nothing more than the gentle act of drifting off. No wood to chop, no animals to check, no stores to ration. Just breathing, slowly, softly, letting each exhale carry away whatever tensions the day accumulated. Think of Elizabeth banking the fire one final time, of children burrowing deeper into quilted warmth, of a family resting together after months of patient endurance. Their struggles shaped a future that eventually shaped yours, a long chain of survival leading link by link to this quiet moment where you lie comfortable and cared for. The lessons they learned, patience, persistence, the importance of community, echo across centuries to reach you here, reminders that humans have always found ways to endure, to hope, to continue. Whatever challenges your own life holds, you carry within you the resilience of generations who faced harder trials and emerged somehow into spring. Let your thoughts slow now, growing soft and unfocused like distant firelight through falling snow. The winter is over in our story, and your own night is beginning, peaceful and undemanding. Tomorrow will come, as it always does, but tomorrow is hours away, and the only task remaining tonight is rest. So close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let go. You've travelled far tonight, through cold and darkness and hope deferred, and now you've arrived at warmth and safety. Sleep well, dream gently, spring is coming.